I'd always loved the outdoors, the smell of fresh pine, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, and the way the sun dappled the forest floor with light. But this time I'd gone too far. I had thought I knew the woods. They were just a few miles from my cabin, a place I'd visited every summer for as long as I could remember. But the moment I took that wrong turn, everything changed. It had started as an ordinary day. I packed my backpack with some snacks, water, and a map, though in hindsight I realize I didn't study it as carefully as I should have. I was just looking to stretch my legs after a long week of work, eager to escape into the quiet of the trees. The first few hours were perfect. I followed the trail I knew well, breathing in the crisp air, enjoying the solitude. There was something about being alone in nature that made everything seem simpler, more peaceful. I felt like I could breathe deeper, like the weight of the world was just a little bit lighter. But then, after a while, I came across a fork in the trail. There was no sign, nothing to tell me which direction was the right one. I'd been here before, and I was sure I knew which way to go. I didn't even check the map. I was confident I'd recognize the path. So I picked a direction and kept walking. First, it seemed fine. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places with thick shrubs and low-hanging branches, but I didn't mind. The forest had always been like that, wild and untamed. I figured I was just on a less traveled part of the path. But as time passed, I realized something was off. The trail started to get harder to follow. The trees were thicker here, the underbrush more dense. The sky above seemed to grow darker, though the sun was still high. I stopped for a moment to look around, thinking maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere, but all I could see were more trees. The woods stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of green and brown. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. The details didn't match up with what I was seeing. There were no landmarks, no clear way to tell where I was. I'd been walking for hours, but everything looked the same. The trail I thought I knew had disappeared. The forest was now unfamiliar and hostile. I started to panic. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to calm myself down. I told myself that I was fine, that I just needed to retrace my steps. But when I turned around, all I saw was a wall of trees. The path had completely disappeared behind me. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I wasn't sure how long I'd been walking, but the sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew I had to make a decision, find a way out or risk being stuck in the woods overnight. The thought of staying in the forest after dark was terrifying. The woods were no place for someone alone at night, especially if you didn't know the area. I needed to find my way back before it got dark. I decided to keep walking in what I hoped was the right direction. I figured if I kept going, I'd eventually find the trail again. But every time I took a step, it felt like the trees grew closer, more oppressive. The sounds of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling, seemed muffled now, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost, really lost. The panic I had been trying to suppress started to take over. My hands shook as I gripped the straps of my backpack, and I could feel the sweat on my neck, though it was cold now. My stomach churned. I didn't know where I was. The trail was gone, the landmarks were gone, and I had no idea how to get back to the cabin. I paused, trying to think. I couldn't stay still for too long. I knew I had to keep moving, but I didn't know which way to go. I'd been walking in circles, trying to spot something familiar, but the forest was endless. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, swallowing me whole. That's when I heard the snap of a twig. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, scanning the woods, but I saw nothing. My eyes darted from tree to tree, but everything looked still. My mind raced. Was someone out there? No. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it was just the forest playing tricks on me. There was no one. I was alone, but the sound had unsettled me. It made my nerves worse. I kept walking faster now, though I wasn't sure why. I could feel the darkness closing in, the sun almost gone now, and I wasn't sure how much time I had left. The forest seemed to be pressing in around me, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I finally stopped when I reached a clearing. The trees opened up to a small patch of grass and wildflowers, and I could see the sky again, though it was darkening quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I was exhausted, hungry, and thirsty, and it was getting colder by the minute. My feet ached, and my mind felt foggy, clouded with worry. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw something. A faint trail, just barely visible beneath the overgrowth. My heart skipped. It was a path. I hadn't imagined it. I quickly hurried over, brushing aside the bushes and branches to make my way down the trail. This path was different, narrower, less defined, but it felt real. It felt like something that might lead somewhere. I followed it, hoping with every step that it would take me home. The sun was nearly gone now, and the forest was growing darker by the second. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther, and the rustling of leaves felt like it was coming from all sides. I don't know how long I walked. My legs were burning, my body aching with fatigue, but I kept going. The trail didn't get any clearer, but I refused to stop. I wouldn't. And then, just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw it, the outline of a structure through the trees. My heart leapt. It was a cabin, my cabin. I had made it. I stumbled forward, my steps clumsy, my legs shaking with relief. As I got closer, I saw the familiar shape of the old wooden cabin in the fading light. It was dark now, but I didn't care. I was back. I had made it. I reached the door, opened it, and stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin hit me, and I let out a shaky breath. The panic that had been gnawing at me all day slowly faded away as I closed the door behind me. I was safe. I sat down on the old wooden floor, my body shaking. My hands were still trembling as I took off my shoes, then my socks, and let my feet breathe. I was exhausted, but I felt a deep sense of relief too. I had made it out of the woods. It was over. I had found my way home. I didn't go back out the next day. I stayed inside, resting, recovering. The forest outside was quiet now, but I wasn't about to take any more chances. The woods were beautiful, yes, but they were also vast and dangerous. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. I'd been lost, but I'd found my way back. That was enough. I knew I wouldn't take the woods for granted again. I didn't think much about getting lost in the woods when I set out that morning. I wasn't a seasoned hiker or anything, but I'd been on plenty of walks through trails near my home. This time, I decided to try somewhere new. I'd read about a forest not far from the town I'd moved to last year. Remote but beautiful, with miles of trails that wound through thick pines and open meadows. The idea of spending the day out there sounded perfect. I started early. The air was still chilly when I parked at the small gravel lot near the trailhead. My backpack felt a little heavy on my shoulders, but I liked knowing I was prepared. Water, snacks, a map I'd printed, and my phone with a fully charged battery. I even packed a flashlight just in case. At the time, it seemed overly cautious for a simple day hike. The first couple of hours were everything I'd hoped for. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. I stopped a few times to take photos, nothing fancy, just snapshots to send to friends later. I didn't see another soul, but that didn't bother me. The solitude felt good. Around noon, I reached a fork in the trail. The map showed the main route veering right and a smaller, less traveled path going left. The left trail wasn't marked on the map, but it looked interesting. Seemed narrower, more rugged. I figured it couldn't hurt to explore it for a little while. I'd just turn back if it got too rough. The path wound deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser here, their branches knitting together overhead. The air felt cooler, and the light dimmed, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful, almost surreal how quiet everything became. I walked for what felt like an hour, and that's when I noticed the first problem. I hadn't seen any trail markers. I stopped and checked the map. Nothing on it matched the terrain I was in. No fork, no narrow side path, nothing. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but the signal was weak, barely 1 bar. The little blue dot jumped around on the screen, making it impossible to tell where I was. Still, I wasn't too worried. I could just turn around and follow the path back to the fork, or so I thought. I walked for another 20 minutes, scanning the ground for the trail I'd come in on. Somehow, it didn't look the same. The trees seemed different, and the path felt less distinct. I started to second-guess myself, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. I paused to get my bearings. The sun had shifted, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I told myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I decided to keep walking, sure I'd find my way back eventually. But I didn't. The trail petered out completely, dissolving into a tangle of underbrush and fallen branches. I kept moving, thinking I could retrace my steps. Each time I thought I recognized something, a twisted tree, a large rock, I realized I'd been wrong. The forest felt endless, every direction blending into a maze of trees. By mid-afternoon, I was sweating, my heart pounding harder with every step. My water bottle was half empty, and I hadn't eaten since morning. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, trying to make sense of where I'd gone wrong. I checked my phone again, still no signal. That was the first moment I felt the sharp edge of fear. I forced myself to think logically. I had enough daylight left to keep moving, so I decided to head in one direction instead of wandering aimlessly. If I walked straight long enough, I'd have to hit a road or a trail eventually, right? The plan sounded good, but the forest had other ideas. The ground became uneven, forcing me to navigate around steep inclines and thick patches of brambles. Every detour felt like a gamble. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, I had no idea which direction I was heading. The forest seemed to grow darker by the minute. The air turned colder, and the shadows deepened. I hadn't seen or heard another person all day, and the loneliness started to press on me. Every sound, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I tried not to think about animals. I knew there were bears in these woods, maybe even mountain lions. I kept walking until the light faded completely. I didn't have a choice but to stop. Using my flashlight, I found a small clearing and sat down on a patch of mossy ground. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I forced myself to eat a granola bar and sip some water. I didn't know how long I'd be out here, so I rationed what I had. The night was long and restless. I leaned against a tree, trying to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under. I woke up shivering, my neck stiff and sore. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. When dawn finally came, I felt a surge of relief. The soft light made the woods look less threatening, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. My water was almost gone, and my legs felt heavy as I started moving again. I don't know how long I walked that day. Hours, maybe. Time blurred into a cycle of hope and frustration. I thought I saw an opening in the trees, a meadow perhaps, but it turned out to be another trick of the light. I called out a few times, my voice cracking from dehydration, but no one answered. By the second night, I was running on fumes. I found a shallow stream and drank straight from it, ignoring the risks. The water was cold and sharp, and it gave me just enough strength to keep going. On the third day, something changed. I stumbled into an area that felt different. less wild. The trees were farther apart, and I saw a faint indentation in the ground that could have been a trail. I followed it, my heart pounding with cautious hope. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it, the distant hum of a car engine. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. I pushed through the underbrush, tripping over roots and scraping my arms on branches. When I broke through the tree line, I almost cried. I had found a dirt road. It wasn't much, just a narrow, rutted path that wound through the forest. But it was enough. I followed it, my legs trembling with every step. About an hour later, I saw a small cabin up ahead. It looked abandoned, but it didn't matter. I knocked on the door, hoping for help, but no one answered. I rested on the porch, too tired to go any farther. Eventually, I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. A pickup truck appeared, its headlights cutting through the trees. The driver stopped and stared at me, clearly surprised to find someone out here. I explained what had happened as best as I could, my words slurring from exhaustion. He gave me water and a ride back to town, where I learned I'd wandered more than 10 miles from the original trail. That experience changed me. I still love the woods, but I respect them more now. I've learned that nature doesn't care about your plans or your confidence. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also indifferent. I'll never forget those 3 days. How close I came to disappearing without a trace. Now, whenever I hike, I carry more than just a map and a phone. I carry the memory of what it felt like to be truly lost. And I never, ever stray from the trail. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. I'd driven out to the national forest early that morning, looking for a chance to clear my mind after a stressful week. I packed light, a bottle of water, a sandwich, a map I'd printed from the internet, and my phone. I had hiking boots, a jacket tied around my waist, and a small backpack. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with the kind of sunshine that made everything look sharper. Felt like the forest was inviting me in. The trail started out wide and clear, with the usual markers and signs pointing the way. I chose a route labeled moderate, planning for a 3-hour loop that would take me to a scenic overlook before circling back to the parking lot. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wouldn't call myself an expert either. I'd done trails like this before, so I wasn't worried. The first hour went smoothly. The trail wound through tall pines, their needles carpeting the ground and muffling my footsteps. The air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine sap. I passed a few other hikers, friendly nods exchanged, but no conversations. When I reached the overlook, the view was stunning. Rolling hills stretched out endlessly, their green tops blending into the horizon. I took a picture, ate half my sandwich, and decided to keep moving. That's when things started to go wrong. About 20 minutes after leaving the overlook, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I must have missed one while enjoying the scenery. But as I kept walking, the path became less defined. Roots and rocks jutted out where the dirt had been worn away, and the trees seemed to crowd closer together. Still, I convinced myself I was on the right track. The map showed a clear loop, and I hadn't taken any turns. Another 10 minutes passed, and unease settled in my chest. The trail I was on now didn't look like a trail at all. It was just a narrow strip of flattened grass winding deeper into the woods. I stopped, pulled out my map, and checked my phone. No service. Typical. The map didn't help much either. It was a basic printout with no real detail. Frustrated, I decided to backtrack. That seemed logical. I just retraced my steps to the last point I was sure of and figure it out from there. But when I turned around, the path behind me looked just as unrecognizable as the one ahead. The trees were identical in every direction, and the ground was a maze of roots and moss. My stomach sank. I told myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I marked the spot with a stick in the dirt, just in case, and started walking in what I thought was the right direction. Minutes turned into an hour. I passed my stick again, realizing I'd been walking in circles. That's when I knew I was officially lost. I sat down to think. My water bottle was half full, and I still had part of my sandwich. I wasn't in immediate danger, but the sun was lower in the sky now, and I didn't want to be stuck out here after dark. The forest, which had felt peaceful earlier, now seemed vast and indifferent. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I decided to try heading downhill. I'd read somewhere that following a slope could lead to water, and where there's water, there's usually civilization. So I picked a direction and started walking. The ground was uneven, and I had to be careful not to trip. My boots scraped against rocks, and branches snagged my jacket. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell if I was making progress. Hours passed. The light was fading fast. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I rationed the last of my water, sipping just enough to keep going. When night fell, the forest transformed. The trees became shadowy giants, their branches twisting like arms. I could barely see a few feet ahead. I used the flashlight on my phone sparingly, worried about draining the battery. I found a flat spot under a tree and decided to stop for the night. Sleeping wasn't an option, I was too scared. Instead, I sat with my back against the trunk, listening to the night sounds. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and once, I heard what I was sure was a coyote in the distance. I clenched my jacket tighter around me and waited for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. Everything looked less menacing in daylight. I got up, stretched my stiff limbs, and started walking again. My plan was simple. Keep moving and hope for a sign of civilization, a road, a cabin, anything. The forest seemed endless, but I tried not to think about that. One step at a time. By midday, hunger gnawed at me. I'd finished the sandwich the previous afternoon and had nothing left to eat. My mouth was parched and my thoughts grew sluggish. I stumbled into a small creek and nearly cried with relief. The water was cold and clear, and I drank until my stomach hurt. It wasn't smart. I knew about the risks of drinking untreated water, but I was desperate. Following the creek felt like my best option, so I walked along its edge. The ground was muddy, and I slipped more than once, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. Hours later, I spotted something in the distance, a fence. My heart raced. It was old and rusted, but it was a sign of people. I climbed over it and kept moving, my energy renewed. The fence led to a dirt road. I don't think I've ever been so happy to see tire tracks in my life. I followed the road for what felt like forever, until finally, I saw a house. It was small and weathered, but smoke curled from the chimney. I knocked on the door, and an older man answered, his face lined with concern as I explained what had happened. He gave me water and let me use his phone to call for help. Sitting in his kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I'd made it out. It took me weeks to fully recover. I'd lost weight, and the exhaustion lingered. But the experience taught me something I won't forget. The wilderness doesn't care about you. If you're not prepared, it will humble you. Now, whenever I go hiking, I take a proper map, extra water, and a whistle. I don't trust printed maps or phone signals anymore. Looking back, I'm not sure how I stayed calm enough to get through it. Maybe it was sheer determination, or maybe I was just lucky. Either way, I'm never underestimating nature again. The air was cold and still, pressing against my skin like an unshakable presence. I'd planned the hike for weeks, researching trails, checking weather forecasts, and even overpacking just to be safe. It wasn't my first solo trip, but something about this one felt different from the start. Maybe it was the unusually quiet morning or the vague sense of unease I felt when I parked my car at the trailhead. Whatever it was, I brushed it off. I slung my pack over my shoulders and headed into the woods. The trail was well marked, at least at first, weaving through tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the gray sky. I'd chosen this route because it was remote, promising solitude and a chance to reset. The silence was comforting at first, just the crunch of my boots on the damp soil and the occasional rustle of branches overhead. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. I kept my pace steady, stopping now and then to sip water or adjust the straps on my pack. I'd brought plenty of snacks, a map, a compass, and even a GPS tracker as a backup. I was prepared, or so I thought. Around noon, the trail started to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and moss-covered. The air felt heavier here, damp and earthy. I didn't think much of it until I came to a fork in the path that wasn't on my map. There were no signs, just two equally worn trails splitting off in opposite directions. I hesitated, pulling out my compass and map to get my bearings. The GPS signal was spotty at best, and the dense canopy overhead made it hard to tell which direction was which. After a few minutes of deliberation, I chose the left path. It felt instinctively right, though in hindsight I realized how little that meant. The trail grew rougher as I went on, the ground uneven and littered with roots that caught at my boots. I kept moving, confident I'd find a marker or some indication I was heading in the right direction. But the further I went, the more the path seemed to dissolve into the forest. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at my sleeves like skeletal hands. By mid-afternoon, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour, and the terrain was starting to look alarmingly unfamiliar. I told myself to stay calm, retracing my steps mentally and trying to remember if I'd missed a turn. I decided to backtrack, but after walking for what felt like another hour, I ended up in the same place I'd started. Panic began to creep in, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I checked my GPS again, but the signal was gone entirely. The map was useless without recognizable landmarks, and the compass seemed to spin aimlessly, as if mocking my attempts to find north. I was alone, with no clear idea of where I was or how to get back. I forced myself to stop and think. I'd read somewhere that panic is the worst thing you can do when you're lost. I needed to conserve energy, find water, and stay put until I could figure out a plan. The sun was already dipping lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. I found a small clearing and set up camp. My pack had a lightweight tarp and a sleeping bag, but as I worked to rig some semblance of shelter, my hands trembled with fear. The realization of my vulnerability hit me like a punch to the gut. Out here, no one would hear me if I screamed. That night was the longest of my life. The forest came alive with sounds I couldn't place. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant cry of some unseen animal. I barely slept, jumping at every noise and clutching the knife I kept in my pack. When dawn finally came, I felt more exhausted than rested. I knew I couldn't stay in one place forever. I needed to find water and, ideally, a way out. I packed up and started walking, trying to keep a steady pace and make note of landmarks as I went. The forest seemed endless, every direction blending into the same monotonous tangle of trees and undergrowth. Around midday, I stumbled upon a creek. The sight of running water filled me with a fragile hope. I knelt down, cupping my hands to drink before refilling my bottle. The cold water soothed my parched throat, but the relief was short-lived. I realized following the creek might lead to a larger water source, or it could lead me deeper into the wilderness. I chose to follow it anyway, reasoning that water was my best bet for survival. The creek twisted and turned, cutting through the dense forest like a silver ribbon. The ground was slippery and uneven, forcing me to move slowly and carefully. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, casting the forest in a dim golden light. By the time night fell, I was no closer to finding my way out. My legs ached, and blisters had formed on my heels from hours of walking. I set up camp again, this time near the creek, hoping the sound of running water would keep my nerves in check. Didn't. The second night was worse than the first. The forest seemed to close in around me, every sound amplified by the oppressive darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by nightmares and the occasional snap of a branch nearby. The next morning, I felt a gnawing sense of urgency. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly. I needed to make a decision. I decided to climb a tree to get a better view of my surroundings, hoping to spot a landmark or, better yet, a clearing. The climb was harder than I anticipated, my muscles protesting with every pull. When I finally reached a sturdy branch near the top, I looked out over the endless sea of green. It was breathtaking in its vastness and utterly disheartening. There was no sign of civilization, just miles of forest stretching in every direction. Despair threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. I spotted a distant ridge that looked slightly less wooded, a potential path out of this nightmare. With renewed determination, I climbed down and started making my way toward it. The journey was grueling. The underbrush was thick, tearing at my clothes and skin as I pushed through. The ridge seemed closer at first, but as the hours wore on, it felt like a mirage, always just out of reach. When I finally reached the base of the ridge, the sun was setting again. I scrambled up the rocky slope, my hands raw from gripping jagged stones. At the top, I collapsed, gasping for breath. That's when I saw it. A thin column of smoke rising in the distance. My heart leapt, hope flooding through me like a tidal wave. Where there's smoke, there's people. I didn't care how far it was or how long it would take. I knew I had to reach it. The next morning, I set out with renewed purpose. The trek was arduous, but the sight of that smoke kept me going. When I finally stumbled into a small clearing and saw the cabin, I nearly cried with relief. The cabin was old and weathered but clearly inhabited. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. I approached cautiously, my voice hoarse as I called out for help. A man emerged, his face lined with years of hard living. He didn't say much, just nodded and ushered me inside. The warmth of the fire and the taste of fresh water were almost overwhelming. I spent the night there, grateful beyond words for the safety and shelter. The man radioed for help the next morning, and within hours, a rescue team arrived to take me back to civilization. I learned later that I'd wandered nearly 15 miles off the main trail. The experience left me shaken, but also profoundly grateful for the simple things: warmth, safety, and the kindness of strangers. I haven't been back to the woods since. Maybe one day I'll try again, but for now, I'm content to stay close to home, where the forest can't swallow me whole. The hike was supposed to be straightforward. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and the air was crisp, carrying a faint pine scent. I had been looking forward to this solo hike all week, a chance to disconnect, clear my head, and escape the noise of everyday life. My plan was simple: follow a marked trail that looped around the forest and brought me back to the parking lot by late afternoon. The map I printed showed a 12-mile path with markers at key points, and I felt confident. I packed light: a bottle of water, some trail mix, a rain jacket, and my phone. I had debated bringing a small first aid kit but decided against it, reasoning that I wouldn't need it on such a short hike. It's funny how, looking back, small decisions can have such huge consequences. The first few miles were perfect. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath my boots. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I paused frequently to take it all in, feeling at peace. Somewhere around mile 5, I came to a fork in the trail. The signpost was weathered, its lettering faded. One arrow pointed left, marked Main Loop, while the other pointed right towards something labeled Overlook. A quick glance at my map didn't show the overlook, but I figured it was a minor detour. Curious and drawn by the thought of a view, I turned right. The path grew narrower, winding through thicker trees. After about 15 minutes, I started to feel uneasy. The trail wasn't as well maintained as the main one, with roots and rocks jutting out, forcing me to watch my step. Still, I kept going, convinced the overlook was just ahead. But the more I walked, the less like a trail it felt. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of turning back, I decided to push forward. I told myself I'd find the main loop eventually, either by circling around or by cutting through the forest. It seemed logical at the time. An hour later, I knew I was in trouble. The trail had vanished completely, replaced by dense undergrowth and scattered trees. The forest felt different here, darker, quieter, almost suffocating. My phone, which had been tracking my route, had no signal. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. The sun was lower now, and the shadows stretched long and thin. I realized I hadn't eaten or drunk anything in hours, so I sat down on a mossy log and pulled out my water bottle. It was almost empty. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but forced it down. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed a plan. The first rule of being lost, I remembered, was to stay put and wait for help. But no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone about the detour, and the trailhead was far enough from town that it didn't get much traffic. If someone realized I was missing, it might not be until late tonight, or even tomorrow. I decided to keep moving. If I could find a stream or a clearing, I might regain my bearings. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or signs of civilization. At least that's what I thought. Hours passed. The forest grew darker, colder. I hadn't brought a flashlight, and my phone battery was draining fast. I tried using its flashlight sparingly, but it only illuminated the immediate area, leaving the rest of the forest an endless black void. By the time night fell completely, I was exhausted. My legs ached, my throat was parched, and every sound made me jump. A snapping twig, a distant rustle, even the hoot of an owl. I found a spot beneath a large tree and huddled there, wrapping my rain jacket around me for warmth. The night was long, and the cold seeped into my bones. When dawn finally broke, I felt a flicker of hope. The morning light made everything seem less threatening, and I forced myself to get up and keep moving. I stumbled upon a small stream not long after and drank greedily, though I knew the water might not be safe. It tasted metallic, but I didn't care. Following the stream seemed like the best option. The terrain was rough, steep slopes, slippery rocks, but the water gave me a direction. I noticed animal tracks along the banks, some of which made my stomach tighten. They were larger than I wanted to think about. Around midday, I found a patch of wild berries. I vaguely remembered reading that some were safe to eat, while others weren't. These were dark purple and looked familiar, so I risked it. They were tart but satisfying, and I ate handfuls until my stomach felt better. The second night was worse than the first. My muscles were stiff and my head throbbed. The forest felt alive in a different way at night, with sounds that didn't seem natural. I barely slept, jolting awake at every noise, real or imagined. On the third day, I started to feel desperate. My water bottle was empty again, and the stream had veered into a marshy area I couldn't navigate. My body felt sluggish, and my thoughts were muddled. Was anyone even looking for me? Would they know where to start? I stumbled on a ridge around noon. Climbing it was painful. Every muscle screamed in protest. But when I reached the top, I saw a dirt road in the distance. Relief surged through me, giving me a burst of energy. I scrambled down the ridge, not caring about scrapes or bruises. The road was deserted, but it was a road. I followed it, dragging my feet, until I saw a mailbox ahead. A mailbox meant a house, and a house meant people. By the time I reached the driveway, I was barely able to stand. A middle-aged man came out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. He helped me inside, gave me water and food, and called for help. It turned out I was nearly 20 miles from the trailhead. I'd wandered far off course, deeper into the wilderness than I ever realized. The man told me I was lucky to have made it out. Now, when I think back to those days, I can still feel the cold and hear the sounds of the forest. It's not an experience I'd ever want to repeat, but it taught me something important. Respect the wild. Always be prepared, even for a short hike, because nature doesn't care about your plans. I didn't plan on spending that night in the cabin. In fact, I hadn't even planned on being in the woods for more than a few hours. It was supposed to be a straightforward hike, just a day trip to clear my head after a rough week at work. The trailhead wasn't far from the parking lot, and I figured I'd be back before sundown. The air was crisp that morning, with the faint scent of pine drifting through the trees, the kind of air that makes you feel alive. I had my day pack with a water bottle, a granola bar, and my phone. I didn't bring a map or a compass because the trail was marked, and I wasn't planning on venturing off it. That turned out to be my first mistake. The trail was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. I chalked it up to the colder weather. It was mid-November, and the first frost had already come and gone. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches stretching toward the sky. About 2 hours in, I decided to take a break at a clearing. I sat on a fallen log and sipped my water, staring out at the expanse of trees. There was something peaceful about being so far from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no people. Just me and the woods. But when I stood up to continue, I realized I hadn't been paying attention to where the trail was. The path that had been so clear earlier now seemed to vanish into the undergrowth. I walked in the direction I thought I'd come from, but nothing looked familiar. I told myself not to panic. The parking lot wasn't far, and I'd find my way back if I just kept walking. An hour passed, then two. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. My phone, which had been my backup plan, had no service. The battery was also draining faster than I'd expected, thanks to the cold. I kept walking, hoping to stumble upon something. A sign, another hiker, or even the sound of traffic in the distance. Instead, I found the cabin. It was small and weathered, tucked between a cluster of trees like it was trying to hide. The wood was dark and splintered, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. The windows were boarded up, but the door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. At first, I thought it might be abandoned, but then I saw the faint trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was here. Relief washed over me as I approached. Whoever lived there could help me get back to the main trail, or at least point me in the right direction. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else I couldn't place. The single room was dimly lit by a fire in the stone hearth. There was a table, a chair, and a cot pushed against the far wall. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust coated every surface. But the fire was fresh, the embers glowing red and orange. Someone had been here recently. I called out, but there was no answer. I hesitated, feeling uneasy about being in someone else's space uninvited. But the cold was biting now, and the fire was the only source of warmth for miles. I decided to wait. Whoever lived here would return eventually, and I could explain my situation then. I sat by the fire, rubbing my hands together to bring the feeling back into my fingers. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of the flames. I noticed a few odd details as I waited. On the table, there was a hunting knife with a blade that looked freshly sharpened. Beside it was a bundle of rope, coiled neatly like it was ready for use. Against the wall, there was an old metal trap, the kind used for catching animals. But it wasn't rusted or dusty like the rest of the cabin. It looked almost new. Something about those objects made my skin crawl. They didn't belong in a place like this. They were too deliberate, too functional. I started to wonder if the person who lived here would actually be the kind of person I wanted to meet. The sun had fully set by the time I heard the sound. Footsteps, crunching through the dead leaves outside. My heart pounded as I stood, unsure of what to do. The door was still open, and I could see the faint outline of a figure approaching. Whoever it was stopped just outside the doorway. I couldn't make out their face, but they were holding something. A long, narrow object slung over their shoulder. A rifle, maybe? They didn't come in. They just stood there, breathing heavily like they'd been running. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was pitch black now, and I had no flashlight. Finally, the person spoke, their voice low and rough. They told me to stay where I was. They stepped into the light of the fire, and I saw their face. It was a man, older than me, with a scruffy beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He didn't ask why I was there or if I needed help. Instead, he started asking questions: where I'd come from, how long I'd been in the woods, and if anyone knew I was out here. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, like he was trying to catch me in a lie. I answered as calmly as I could, but I could feel the tension building in the room. He didn't like my answers, and I could tell he didn't trust me. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me it wasn't safe to be out here alone. When I asked why, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I knew I couldn't stay. As soon as he turned his back to tend to the fire, I grabbed my pack and bolted out the door. I ran blindly into the darkness, the branches clawing at my face and arms. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that cabin. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. The cold seeped into my bones, but I didn't dare stop for long. I could still hear him in my head, his words echoing. It's not safe out here. I spent the rest of the night wandering, too afraid to rest for more than a few minutes at a time. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally saw something that made my heart leap. A dirt road cutting through the trees. I followed it until I found a ranger station. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy when I told him about the cabin. He said there weren't any cabins like that in the area. I didn't argue. I was just glad to be out of those woods. But even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about the man and his words. What wasn't safe out there? And more importantly, was it still out there, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble upon that cabin? It started as a casual afternoon hike. I had no plans to do anything intense, just a short walk to clear my head. The weather was crisp but comfortable, the kind of cool air that whispers promises of autumn. I'd found a trailhead not far from where I parked my car, and it seemed like an easy loop. It wasn't marked, but it looked well-trodden, so I figured it couldn't be that hard to follow. I thought I'd be out and back in an hour or two. The trail began simply enough, cutting through a mix of pine and deciduous trees. The ground was blanketed in leaves, and the occasional exposed roots made me watch my step. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I could hear the distant sound of birds and the faint rustle of wind through the canopy. I felt at ease, almost like I was alone in a peaceful painting. For a while, I just enjoyed the rhythm of walking, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the way the light dappled through the trees. But then, I noticed something odd. The trail started to narrow, the once-packed dirt path giving way to patches of grass and weeds. At first, I thought nothing of it. Trails often change in condition. I pressed on, assuming it would loop back toward where I started. When I saw a small creek, I took it as a good sign. Water usually means civilization isn't far. But as I followed the trail alongside the creek, it became harder to see where the path was heading. I glanced behind me and realized the trail was barely visible. It had faded into the forest floor. I stopped and looked around, my chest tightening a little. The trees all looked the same, tall and indifferent, their branches swaying gently. There were no markers, no signs of the parking area, just an endless stretch of forest. I told myself not to panic. If I retraced my steps, I'd find my way back. I turned around, trying to mentally mark the path I'd taken. But when I walked back, everything looked different. The sense of unease grew stronger. I felt stupid for not paying closer attention to the trail earlier. My phone, of course, had no signal. The thought crossed my mind that I should have told someone where I was going, but it felt unnecessary at the time. After all, it was just a short hike. I decided to stick close to the creek, thinking it would eventually lead me to a larger body of water or at least some kind of recognizable landmark. The forest grew denser as I walked. The trees closed in tighter, and the ground became uneven, dotted with rocks and hidden holes. Every step felt like a gamble. I slipped a few times, my hands catching myself on damp moss or jagged roots. Hours passed. The sun, which had been high when I started, was now dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I hadn't brought any food or water. I hadn't planned to be out this long. My legs were starting to ache, but stopping felt dangerous. If I sat down, I might lose my momentum. Besides, the thought of sitting in this endless forest, alone and uncertain, was unbearable. As the light dimmed, I started to think about what I'd do if night fell before I found my way out. The idea of being in the woods after dark terrified me. I had no flashlight, no jacket, nothing to make myself comfortable or safe. I scoured the ground for sticks I could use as walking aids, picking up one sturdy enough to lean on. It was small comfort, but it felt like I was doing something to prepare. The forest grew eerily quiet. The birdsong had stopped, replaced by the occasional creak of a tree or the distant sound of water. Every little noise made me jump. A twig snapping, leaves rustling in the wind. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I forced myself to focus on practical things. I remembered reading that streams often lead to rivers, and rivers often lead to towns or roads. I decided to follow the creek no matter what. It wasn't easy. The terrain was rough, and I had to cross the water several times, soaking my shoes and making every step heavier. The cold from the water seeped through my socks, chilling me to the bone. At one point, I stumbled into a patch of thorny bushes. The sharp branches scraped my arms and legs, leaving thin red lines across my skin. I swore under my breath, frustration bubbling over. It felt like the forest was mocking me, throwing obstacles in my way every chance it got. But I kept moving, my breaths coming faster as the light continued to fade. Eventually, I came to a clearing. It was small, just a break in the trees, but it felt like a victory. I could see the sky more clearly here, though the sight didn't offer much comfort. The sun was almost gone, the last traces of daylight slipping away. I decided to stop for a moment and take stock of my situation. I found a fallen log and sat down, my head in my hands. I tried to think logically. I wasn't completely lost. If I stayed near the creek, I'd eventually find something. But the forest was vast, and I had no idea how far I'd wandered. My body ached, my feet throbbed, and my throat was parched. I looked at the creek water, wondering if it was safe to drink. I'd read somewhere that running water was usually okay, but the thought of getting sick out here was too much. I decided to hold off for now. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, the temperature dropped sharply. I regretted not bringing a jacket, shivering as I hugged myself for warmth. The noises of the night began. Crickets, distant howls, the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to block it out, focusing on the stars above. They were bright and beautiful, but they offered no guidance. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every noise made me jump, and the cold was unbearable. I sat with my back against the log, clutching the stick I'd picked up earlier like a weapon. My mind raced with thoughts of what might be lurking out there. Bears, wolves, or worse, nothing at all. The isolation was its own kind of predator, gnawing at my sanity. When morning came, it wasn't the bright, hopeful sunrise I'd imagined. The forest remained dim, the light barely piercing through the thick canopy. My body protested as I stood, every muscle sore from sitting on the hard ground. I forced myself to keep moving, knowing that staying in one place wouldn't help. The creek eventually widened into a small river, which gave me a glimmer of hope. I followed it tirelessly, ignoring the hunger pangs and the aching in my legs. Around midday, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. The distant hum of traffic. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The sound filled me with a burst of energy I didn't know I had. I pushed forward, the noise growing louder with each step. The river led me to a bridge, and beyond it, a narrow road. I stumbled onto the pavement, tears streaming down my face. A car passed not long after, and I flagged it down, my voice hoarse and shaking as I explained what had happened. The driver, an older man, offered me water and a ride to the nearest town. I don't remember much of what I said to him. I was too exhausted to think straight, but I'll never forget the relief of seeing buildings again, of knowing I was safe. Looking back, I realized how foolish I was to venture into the woods unprepared. It was a harsh lesson, but one I'll never forget. I haven't been hiking since, and I don't think I ever will. The forest isn't something to take lightly. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also unforgiving. After a long day of hiking through the dense forest of the Swiss Alps, our group of 4 arrived at our campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. We were all exhausted from the 12-mile trek, but there was something oddly satisfying about reaching the end of our trail. The trees surrounded us in a protective embrace, their tall trunks rising up like silent sentinels. We quickly unloaded our backpacks and began setting up our tents. It didn't take long before the fire pit was dug, and we had a small fire crackling away, throwing warm light into the gathering dusk. There was something comforting about the flames as they flickered, casting long shadows around us. I sat by the fire, peeling off my boots and sighing with relief as I stretched my sore feet out. Emily, always the one to take charge of everything, made sure the fire was well fed with wood. She was in her late 20s, a few years younger than me, but had this no-nonsense attitude that made her a natural leader. Emily had organized this trip, and while I had my reservations about the remote location, I trusted her judgment. Our group consisted of me, Emily, and 2 of our friends. Daniel, a quiet, introverted guy in his early 30s, and Nora, a woman around my age who loved to joke and always lighten the mood, even when things felt tense. We hadn't been on a hiking trip like this for a while, and the thrill of being out in the wilderness felt like the perfect escape. That night, we roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and laughed. But as the fire began to die down, I couldn't help but notice how still the forest had become. There was no wind rustling through the trees, no chirping of crickets, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of the firewood settling. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, that I heard it, a faint rustling from somewhere in the dark woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a squirrel moving through the underbrush. We were far from any towns, and wildlife was common in these parts. I glanced over at the others. They didn't seem to notice it. Emily was talking to Nora about some new hiking gear she had bought. Daniel was fiddling with his phone, his face lit by the dim light, and Nora was half listening, half staring into the fire. I shrugged off the unease that crawled up my spine and returned my focus to the fire. But the rustling continued, faint but persistent. It seemed to be moving closer, just beyond the tree line. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight I had left by my pack. "I'll check it out," I said, my voice sounding less certain than I wanted it to. Emily gave me a quick glance but didn't argue. "Be careful." I stepped away from the warmth of the fire, the cool night air hitting my skin. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and thick underbrush. I scanned the area, but all I could see were the outlines of the towering pines, their trunks seeming to stretch endlessly into the night. Nothing.
Ibaita a moment, listening.
The rustling had stopped. Maybe it had just been a small animal after all. I made my way back to the camp, shaking my head at myself. The wilderness could make you paranoid, I supposed. "I don't know what I was thinking," I said as I sat back down beside the fire. Emily didn't look up. She seemed a little distant, like her mind was somewhere else. The rest of the night passed without incident. We all settled into our tents by 11 p.m., the forest around us eerily silent. Sleep came easily, my body too tired to keep up with any lingering worries. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp earth and the sound of birds calling in the distance. The camp was quiet, too quiet. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, blinking against the bright morning light. That's when I noticed something strange. Daniel's tent was empty. It wasn't just that he was gone. His sleeping bag and gear were still inside. His pack, the one he always kept by his side, was untouched. It was as if he had gotten up and walked away in the middle of the night. "Emily," I called softly, stepping over to her tent. She emerged a moment later, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" I pointed to Daniel's tent. "He's gone." She looked at the empty space. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. Where would he have gone? It's too early for him to be off hiking alone. We both stood there, staring at the tent for a moment. I don't know why, but I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a feeling I couldn't shake. This wasn't just a case of him waking up early and going for a walk. Something was wrong. Nora came out of her tent a few moments later, stretching and yawning. "What's going on?" "Daniel's missing," I said, my voice tight, face paled. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean, he's gone," Emily said, frustration creeping into her voice. "His tent's still here, but there's no sign of him." We started searching immediately, checking the area around the campsite. We called his name, though I knew it was pointless. The forest was dense, and there were no signs of a struggle, no obvious trail that would lead us to him. Felt like he had just vanished into thin air. Then we noticed something strange. There were footprints, barefoot, odd-shaped, and leading away from the camp into the forest. They didn't look like they had been made by a wild animal. They were too human, but not quite right. The stride was uneven, as though whoever made them was stumbling, or perhaps dragging their feet. We followed the prints for what felt like hours. Every so often, we would find small signs that something had disturbed the ground. The rustle of leaves, a branch broken low to the ground, but it all felt disjointed, like the trail had been deliberately left to confuse us. The deeper we went into the forest, the more unsettling it became. The silence was oppressive. It felt like the trees themselves were watching us. Eventually, the trail stopped, right in the middle of a clearing. The footprints simply disappeared, as if they had vanished into thin air. We searched the area for any signs of him, but there was nothing. Just the dense undergrowth and trees stretching up toward the sky. By now, the sun was high, and the weight of our situation began to settle in. Daniel was gone, and we had no idea where he could be. "We need to call for help," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. But her phone had no signal, and mine didn't either. We were isolated, completely cut off from the world. Nora, who had been quiet up until that point, finally spoke. "What if he just wandered off? Maybe he got disoriented and—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "This doesn't feel right. Something happened here. We can't just ignore it." We spent the rest of the day searching, but it was clear that there was no simple explanation. By nightfall, we were all exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The decision was made to return to the campsite, as we had no choice but to regroup and figure out what to do next. That night, none of us could sleep. Every creak of the tent in the wind, every snap of a twig outside, had us on edge. I kept thinking about the strange footprints and how they just stopped. The longer I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Daniel hadn't just wandered off. The next morning, we packed up and hiked out as quickly as we could, sticking to the main trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting Daniel to jump out from behind a tree, laughing about some prank he'd pulled. But he didn't. He never showed up. We made it to the nearest village by late afternoon and contacted the authorities. They launched a search, but after days of combing through the forest, they came up empty-handed. There were no new clues, no sign of Daniel. We never found out what happened to him. But there's one thing I know for sure. Daniel didn't just disappear. Something happened out there in those woods. Something that none of us understood. The mystery still lingers in my mind every time I think back to that trip. We may never know the truth, but the forest kept its secrets, and I'll never forget the feeling of standing there, watching the footprints fade into nothing. I had been hiking for hours, the sun high and hot above me, the air thin and dry in the late summer heat. I didn't expect much today, just a quiet walk to clear my head. The trail had started quiet enough, an old logging road cutting through the thick pines and birches of the forest. The kind of hike you do when you just need to be alone. But as the afternoon stretched on, something changed. In the distance, I noticed a thin plume of smoke rising into the sky. It wasn't much at first, barely a wisp caught by the wind, but it caught my attention. I figured it was from a controlled burn, a routine thing they did around here. I'd been hiking in these mountains enough to know that wildfires weren't uncommon, especially in a dry year like this one. It was no big deal. I kept moving, though just a little faster now. The smoke seemed to thicken as I pressed on, and the air grew heavier. The scent of burning would sharp in my nose. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a big forest, and the fire seemed far off. It wasn't until I heard the crackling, the unmistakable sound of burning wood, that I started to worry. I stopped for a moment to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. There was something unsettling in the sound, like it was closer than I realized. The crackling became a roar, the wind picking up, pushing the smoke in thick, choking waves across the trail. I turned around, and for the first time since I'd started the hike, I noticed that the forest had become eerily quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, just the crackling fire growing louder, like it was coming straight for me. I turned back toward the trail, my heart starting to race. The only way out was the way I came, but as I jogged back, I saw the trail was already filled with people. Others who had been hiking too, now running in the opposite direction. Panic was starting to set in, and I could see it in their eyes, the fear in their faces. The fire was moving fast. I pushed through the group, trying to stay calm. But the more I looked around, the more I realized the fire was closing in. Fast. The wind had picked up, and the smoke was so thick now, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The temperature had started to rise, and my skin felt hot under the heavy air. I made a snap decision. I couldn't go back the way I came. The trail was already crowded with hikers trying to escape, and it was obvious they were struggling. I couldn't stay in that chaos. I needed to find a way out of the forest, but I couldn't see any clear path. The fire was getting closer, and every step forward felt like I was walking into the heat of it. I made my way through the thick trees, ducking low and pushing branches out of the way. The trail had turned into a labyrinth of underbrush and rocks. Each step felt like a gamble, the fire growing louder, the air heavier with the scent of burning pine and ash. I could hear the crackling all around me now, not just in one direction, but from every corner. The fire was coming at me from all sides. At one point, I thought I saw an old dirt road through the trees, a possible escape route. But as I ran toward it, a sharp crack sounded from behind, and a tree branch snapped like a rifle shot. I turned just in time to see the fire leaping from the ground to the canopy above, engulfing everything in a fiery flash. The heat was unbearable, the smoke so thick that I could barely breathe. I knew I couldn't make it through that. I couldn't go forward, and I couldn't go back. Every direction was blocked by flames or falling trees. For a moment, I felt completely trapped, hopeless. But then I remembered something. There was a cabin nearby. I'd seen it on the map before, a small, isolated cabin by a lake, used mostly by hunters in the winter. I didn't know if it was still standing or if it had been abandoned, but it was my only hope. It was the only place I could think of that might be far enough from the fire to survive. I sprinted through the forest, desperate now, ignoring the stinging smoke in my eyes, the thick ash that fell like snow around me. I kept my head low, watching for any sign of the cabin. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it was just the wind or the shadows of burning trees. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been an hour or maybe more. My legs were burning, my lungs aching with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. Finally, through the haze of smoke, I saw it, the cabin. It was old, made of dark wood, with a weathered roof and a front porch that sagged with age. But it was still standing. I stumbled up the steps, my hands shaking as I reached for the door. It creaked open, and I collapsed inside, closing the door behind me. I could hear the crackling of the fire outside, but the cabin was a small fortress, its walls thick enough to keep most of the heat at bay. I tried to catch my breath, every inhale like inhaling fire, but at least I was safe. The night was long. The fire raged outside, the wind howling through the trees. I kept the door shut tight, the windows covered with whatever old sheets I could find. There was no light except for the flickering of the fire outside, casting long shadows through the small gaps in the walls. At some point, I heard voices outside. People, panicked voices, calling for help. I thought about going out, about helping, but then I remembered how close the fire was, how quickly it had consumed everything around me. There was no way I could make it back out there. No way I could risk it. As the night wore on, the smoke began to settle. The wind died down, and the air felt still, almost suffocating. But by dawn, the fire had passed, leaving only smoldering trees and ash in its wake. The world outside was eerily quiet, but it was over. I was alive. I walked outside the cabin, the heat from the ground still radiating in waves. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the destruction. The forest was scarred, the trees blackened and twisted from the flames. But there was hope too. A small patch of green survived here and there, new life beginning to sprout in the ashes. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I'd made it through. The fire had come fast, and it had taken everything in its path. But I had survived, and that was all that mattered. It was a weekend trip we had planned for months. Alex and I had been looking forward to this hiking adventure ever since we bought the cabin last year. It was secluded, tucked in the woods of Vermont, our perfect getaway from the noise of city life. We both needed a break. We'd been living in the chaos of everyday life for far too long, and I could feel the weight of it all on my shoulders. The fresh air, the quiet, the promise of a few days away from everything. It was exactly what we needed. I should have known that things wouldn't go as planned. The first few hours were blissful. We hiked through the dense woods, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. The sky above us was clear, the sun peeking through the leaves, casting a warm glow on the forest floor. We talked about everything: work, our families, what we wanted from this cabin, and how much we were looking forward to the next few days. It felt good to be out there together, away from the noise and the responsibilities of daily life. But then, as we neared a fork in the trail, things started to change. We'd reached a point where the path split, the left one winding deeper into the forest and the right one leading towards the river. We'd been hiking for hours, and I could see that Alex was getting frustrated. I hadn't noticed before, but now I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept looking at the map and then back at the trails as though there was a choice he needed to make. "Let's take the shortcut," he said suddenly, pointing to the left trail that veered off to the side. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice cautious. I had heard stories about hikers getting lost in these woods, and I knew this was the less traveled path. It didn't feel right. "It'll be quicker. We'll get to the cabin before dark. We don't want to be out here after sunset." His voice had a hard edge to it that I hadn't heard before. I could see his jaw tightening, his eyes narrow. I didn't like the sound of it. I wanted to take the longer path, the one that followed the river, because it was easier to follow and felt safer. But I didn't want to start an argument. Not here, not now. So I agreed to go with his decision, even though a part of me felt uneasy. The further we went down the shortcut, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. The trees were thicker here, and the air grew cooler. I kept glancing over at Alex, who was moving ahead, not looking back, and I felt a pang of doubt. Something about this felt off, like we were heading into unknown territory. After a while, Alex stopped. "This way," he said, turning off the path and heading towards a small clearing that I hadn't seen earlier. I hesitated but followed him anyway. The clearing was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest had gone still. "This isn't right," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think we should turn back." Alex didn't answer. He was already moving deeper into the clearing, the map in his hands as he tried to figure out where we were. "Alex," I called after him. "I'm not sure about this. I don't like it." But he was already out of earshot. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I couldn't just let him wander off alone. But when I caught up with him, he was already far ahead, the gap between us widening. I called his name again, but there was no answer. It was as if he couldn't hear me. I watched him disappear into the trees, my heart sinking. What was happening? Why was he acting like this? Finally, my frustration got the best of me. I stopped trying to chase him and stood there in the middle of the forest, angry and confused. I told myself I'd wait for him, that he'd realize he was wrong and come back. But as the minutes ticked by and the shadows grew longer, a knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was fear. I started walking again, this time trying to retrace my steps. I knew I should have stayed put, but the thought of being lost in this dark, tangled forest alone was worse than the idea of going after Alex. I pushed through the underbrush, trying to stay on the path, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the overgrown shrubs, they all blurred together. I couldn't remember which way I had come from, couldn't find the trail. My mind raced as I tried to think of where to go next. The panic set in slowly at first, but soon it was all-consuming. What if I couldn't find him? What if something had happened to him? The forest seemed to close in even tighter around me. The sounds of nature had disappeared entirely, and the only noise was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I kept calling Alex's name, hoping for an answer, but all I heard was silence. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, haunting shadows through the trees. I could feel the darkness creeping in, and the cold, too. I didn't want to be out here when it was dark. I picked up the pace, moving faster, but I was getting more and more lost. Every turn I took led me further into unfamiliar woods. The trees, the rocks, everything felt wrong. The sense of isolation, the vastness of the forest, it was overwhelming. It wasn't long before I lost all sense of direction. I wasn't just worried anymore. I was terrified, couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find something, anything, that looked familiar. But there was nothing. It was just me and the endless forest, the night slowly swallowing me whole. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, a crackling sound in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat, and I rushed toward the noise, desperate for any sign of life. As I pushed through the trees, I saw a flicker of light up ahead, an orange glow that seemed like it had to be a campfire. Relief flooded over me as I hurried toward it, but when I reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't a campfire. It was the dim light of a lantern hanging from a tree, swaying gently in the wind. Beneath it, Alex's backpack sat on the ground, empty. My stomach dropped. I called his name again, but no answer came. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, pressing in, suffocating me. There was no sign of him anywhere. No footsteps, no movement, just the eerie quiet of the forest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break down and cry, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving. I had to find him. But where? I sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing, my mind racing for any possible explanation. But the only thing I could think of was the forest, how easily it could swallow you whole, how it could trick you into thinking you were on the right path when you were actually miles off course. And then it hit me. What if he had been as lost as I was? What if he had wandered off the trail and kept going, convinced he was going in the right direction? What if he was still out there somewhere? I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where to go, no idea if I was even on the right trail. The night was getting colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But then, just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I heard something, a voice, a faint cry in the distance. It was Alex. I knew it. I scrambled to my feet, the terror that had paralyzed me only moments before suddenly giving way to adrenaline. I followed the sound of his voice, my steps quickening as I moved through the darkness. And finally, I found him. He was sitting by a fallen tree, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with fear. "I couldn't find my way back," he whispered. "I thought you'd left me. I thought I was never going to get out of here." I knelt down beside him, wrapping my arms around him, finally feeling the safety of human contact. We had made it, together, but as we sat there in the dark, the silence pressing around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching us, waiting, ready to swallow us whole. We never spoke about what had happened in those woods. It was too much, too strange. But we left the next morning, packed up, and never came back to that cabin. Some parts of the woods you just don't walk through, and some things you never talk about. We never argued about directions again. After hours of hiking through the thick forest, my legs were aching and I was starting to feel a bit exhausted. The trail had been clear at first, well marked with bright yellow paint on trees and small signs to guide the way. But as I pressed on, the markers started to thin out. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was just a stretch where the trail didn't need as much upkeep. But when I looked around, the trees and shrubs were closing in, almost like they were pushing me further into the woods. The path wasn't as clear anymore, and the farther I went, the more it seemed to fade into the dense undergrowth. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, trying to take in my surroundings. My name is Ethan, and I'm no stranger to hiking. I've spent plenty of time out in the wilderness over the years, so the thought of getting lost didn't initially concern me. But there was something unsettling about this place. The woods felt silent. Not the usual rustling of wind through leaves or chirping birds, just silence. I couldn't remember the last time I saw or heard anything. My instincts told me something was off, but I didn't want to panic. I pushed the thought aside and started walking again, hoping to find a sign or something familiar. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started to question if I was still on the right track. The trail had become a mere suggestion now, with the ground covered in a tangle of branches and thick ferns. I kept going, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping up on me. It was then that I realized the markers I had passed earlier, those brightly painted strips of yellow, were nowhere to be found. In their place were overgrown vines and weeds, and I started to wonder if I'd somehow missed a turn. I retraced my steps, my heart beginning to pound as I tried to find any familiar signs. But nothing. The markers were gone. It was like the trail had never existed. Panic slowly began to set in as I realized how alone I was. There were no sounds, no signs of anyone around, just the thick forest stretching in all directions. My mind started to race. Was I lost? How far had I wandered off the trail? I tried to remember the last time I had seen a marker, but my mind was a blur of confusion. I checked my phone, but the signal was weak, and it wasn't even showing any map. I knew I had a small battery left, so I didn't want to waste it by relying on a GPS that wouldn't work. I kept walking in what I thought was the direction I had come from. The further I went, though, the more uncertain I became. Every tree looked the same. The ground was uneven, and the underbrush seemed to grow thicker with every step I took. I called out, but my voice didn't seem to reach anyone. The isolation of it all was suffocating. No one would hear me even if I shouted. The reality of being lost in the middle of nowhere began to sink in, and the weight of it was heavy on my chest. Hours had passed, but it felt like days. My legs were sore, and I was dehydrated. I was starting to feel lightheaded. I took a swig of water from my bottle and tried to focus. I needed to stay calm. I had to think. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The temperature was dropping, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. I didn't want to spend the night in the woods, especially with no fire or means to stay warm. I decided to stop for a moment, sit down, and think. Maybe I was too focused on trying to retrace my steps. I needed to stop panicking and assess the situation clearly. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head. But when I opened them again, I realized something. The forest had changed. The trees around me no longer looked familiar. The whole landscape felt different, strange, as if I had wandered into some part of the forest I didn't recognize. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just lost. I had walked in circles. The thought made my stomach drop. I had been walking in one direction, thinking I was going back the way I came, but it didn't make sense anymore. It didn't add up. How could I not have noticed that I was going in circles? I forced myself to keep moving, trying to stay focused. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. The trees were getting thicker, and the underbrush was nearly impossible to push through. Every now and then, I thought I saw a faint shape or shadow in the distance, but when I moved closer, there was nothing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the trees and silence. By the time night had fully fallen, I was out of options. I knew I needed to find shelter, and fast. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was visible in the cold air. My stomach growled with hunger, but there was nothing to eat. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept walking, desperate for any sign of a way out. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. I stopped and froze, looking around. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a cabin. It was old, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. I could hardly believe my eyes. A cabin. I didn't think there was any development out here, but there it was. It didn't look like it had been abandoned too long, but it definitely wasn't well kept. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light flickering from inside. I hesitated for a moment. It felt strange to approach it, but I had no other choice. I was freezing, exhausted, and completely lost. The thought of spending another night out in the woods was unbearable. So, I slowly made my way toward the cabin. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my weight. I pushed the door open a bit further, calling out softly. But there was no answer. No one inside. It was eerily quiet. I stepped in, careful not to make too much noise, and closed the door behind me. The cabin was dark, except for the dim light from a small lamp in the corner. The place smelled musty, and there was dust everywhere. The floor was creaky, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I scanned the room. It was empty. No one had been there for a while, but it was warm inside. I pulled off my jacket and collapsed onto the nearest chair, my legs giving out from exhaustion. I had no idea who owned the cabin or why it was here, but I wasn't going to question my luck. For the first time all day, I felt a small sense of relief. I spent the night in that cabin. I didn't sleep much. Too many thoughts ran through my mind. How had I gotten so lost? What if I hadn't found this place? What if I didn't make it out of the woods? The next morning, I woke up early, the light filtering through the cracks in the walls. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I needed to get back to civilization, but at least I had made it through the night. When I left the cabin, I followed the trail I had stumbled upon earlier, hoping it would lead me to some sort of sign or marker. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally saw the faint outline of a sign ahead. It was a trail marker, one I recognized from the beginning of my hike. I had made it. I was back on track. The experience had left me shaken, but I had learned a valuable lesson that day. No matter how sure you are of your direction, always be aware of your surroundings. The woods can change without warning, and it's easy to lose track of where you are. But I made it out. It was over. I was going home. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A few days in the mountains, some peace and quiet, no distractions. I'd packed light, just the essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, and a few books to keep me company. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, so everything seemed lined up perfectly. I started my hike early in the morning, as soon as the sun started to rise over the ridges. The trail was narrow at first, winding through thick forest, but soon opened up to a more rugged, less traveled path. The kind of trail that makes you feel like you're getting away from it all. Birds were chirping, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was everything I wanted it to be, peaceful and isolated. Around noon, I was passing through a clearing when I saw them, 2 hikers. They were ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction, but they stopped when they saw me. I gave them a friendly wave, like you do when you cross paths with fellow hikers. They didn't wave back. One of them, a man, nodded awkwardly, but the woman next to him didn't even glance my way. There was something off about them, like they were just a little too stiff, a little too mechanical. "Nice day for a hike, huh?" I asked, trying to be friendly. The man's voice was low, almost a mumble. "Yeah, good day." I waited for more, but there was nothing else. Just that uncomfortable silence. I shifted my pack, glancing at the woman. She hadn't said a word. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She stared off into the trees, her expression unreadable. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just not the talkative type, and continued on my way. But as I made my way deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every so often, I would glance behind me and they would be there. Still walking, still ahead of me, but always just far enough to keep a distance. The man's head would turn once in a while, and I'd catch his eyes. But that was it. No more conversation. By mid-afternoon, I began to notice a pattern. Every time I would stop for a break, just to sip some water or catch my breath, I'd hear their voices. Faint, like whispers, but unmistakably close. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but it was becoming more frequent. Each time I stopped, they'd be just over a ridge or through a thicket, out of sight but always close. The uneasy feeling started to grow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just on the same trail. After all, it was a relatively popular route, even if it was a little out of the way. But the longer the day went on, the stranger it all felt. It wasn't until I stumbled across their abandoned backpacks that the panic started to creep in. It was just past a small creek when I noticed them. 2 heavy-duty packs lying on the side of the trail, partially covered by fallen leaves. My first instinct was to think they had just taken a break. But something about the way they were left behind, the way they looked almost abandoned, set me on edge. No one would leave their packs like that unless something was wrong. I approached them slowly, my heart racing. The packs looked perfectly fine, no obvious signs of damage or struggle. But when I peered inside one of them, my stomach turned. There was no food, no water, only a few odd items, a first aid kit, a map, some rope. It didn't make sense. The trail was rough, and the weather was unpredictable. Whoever was out here needed their supplies. The thought of the hikers, so distant and strange, now made my blood run cold. I checked the other pack, and it was the same. Just strange, random items. But no food, no real survival gear. I felt my chest tighten as I realized the obvious. Those hikers had been following me. I had been so caught up in my own thoughts, so busy trying to shake the feeling, that I hadn't noticed them staying just behind me. But now it was clear. They had been following me for miles. That I quickly picked up my pace, my mind racing. There was no way I was going to camp in this area tonight. I needed to find a safer spot, somewhere more open, more visible. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but the sound of their voices, those faint, distant whispers, kept echoing in my ears. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Were they trying to get closer without me noticing? Or were they simply waiting for the right moment? The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the path. I couldn't risk staying on the trail any longer. I turned off into the woods, hoping to find some sort of clearing or an area where I could make camp. But the further I went, the more isolated I became. There were no signs of life, no animals, no birds, just silence. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like lead. Hours passed, and I was starting to lose track of time when I finally stumbled across a small cabin. It was old, but still standing. Weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a small porch. It looked abandoned, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. I approached it cautiously, my senses heightened. But when I pushed the door open, I was met with the comforting smell of old wood and dust. It was empty. I immediately decided to make camp inside. I locked the door and set up my tent on the cabin's floor. As I sat there, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sounds outside, the wind, the rustling of leaves felt too deliberate, too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint knock. It came from the back of the cabin, light but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way anyone could have followed me in this deep. I had lost them hours ago, right? Another knock, louder this time. I didn't move. I stayed still, my body frozen with fear. Whoever was out there, whoever had been following me all day, was now outside, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, my hands trembling. The knock came again, this time followed by a faint scratching sound. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to listen. There was something out there, moving, but I couldn't see it. My heart was pounding in my ears as I debated my next move. The door was locked, but I couldn't stay in this cabin forever. Eventually, I would need to leave. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, on the wooden porch outside. Someone was pacing. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. My mind raced through every possibility, every scenario. They could just be hikers, but the way they had acted, the way they had disappeared, wasn't normal. And now I wasn't sure if they were alone. Finally, the door creaked open. It wasn't as loud as I expected, and I quickly ducked into the shadows, hiding in the back corner of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting to see if anyone would come inside. Seconds dragged into minutes, and I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, entering the cabin. I held my flashlight tightly, trying not to make a sound, my mind racing. I didn't know who was in here with me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't gonna let them get close. It was the kind of day where the sun barely made it through the thick clouds, and the air felt damp with the promise of rain. I had never been good at tracking, but the desperation in the voice of the mother had been enough to convince me to take on the search. The child had gone missing in the woods just outside of our town. Nothing unusual at first, just a little boy who had wandered too far, they thought. But hours had passed, and no one had heard a thing since. The woods weren't far from my cabin, but I knew them like the back of my hand. It was the same place I'd gone to escape from everything: work, people, the noise of everyday life. I grabbed my pack, slipped on my boots, and headed out the door. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting its slow descent, casting long shadows over the trees. The trail from where the boy was last seen led into the dense forest, thick with evergreens and underbrush. I wasn't sure how far I would need to go to find him, but I knew it wasn't going to be quick. After a quick glance at the small group of volunteers already searching in the distance, I decided to head off on my own. It felt like a decision I would regret, but at the time I felt like I could do more than wait. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the kind of forest floor that sinks with every step. Leaves crackled as I pushed my way through thick undergrowth, my senses alert for any sign of movement. It didn't take long before I saw the first sign. A branch bent at an odd angle, a shirt caught in the brush. It was torn, jagged, as if someone or something had grabbed it and pulled. I knelt down and inspected it, but there was no blood, no real signs of struggle, just the fabric, ripped in a way that didn't make sense. I stood up and looked around, feeling the first pang of unease creeping through me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just silence. I pressed on. Deeper I went, the more the world around me seemed to close in. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, just a sense that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shift in the air, a creak of a branch in the distance. But the further I moved, the more it intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. There was a clearing ahead, and I pushed forward toward it, hoping to get a better view of the landscape. But when I stepped into the open space, the ground was different. The earth had a spongy texture, like I had wandered into a bog. The trees around me were gnarled, twisted, as if they had grown to entangle each other. I paused, scanning the area for any signs of the child, but the only thing that caught my attention was a trail, a series of small footprints in the mud, leading deeper into the woods. The prints were small, too small to belong to an adult, but they didn't seem to go in a straight line. Instead, they wove in and out, curving in odd directions. I squatted down and traced the marks with my finger, trying to make sense of the path. It wasn't what I expected. No straight line of movement, no clear direction, just circles. I straightened up and glanced around. That's when I noticed it. The trees. Something about them seemed wrong. It wasn't just the way they twisted or the way the light filtered through the branches, but the feeling they gave me. They seemed to bend toward me, almost like they were leaning in, watching. I had read about pareidolia before, the way people can see faces in shadows, but this felt different. These trees didn't just look like faces, they felt like eyes. I pushed the thought aside and focused back on the trail. The footsteps led on, spiraling out like a maze. I followed them for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the strange pattern. It wasn't until the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the forest floor, that I realized I wasn't just following a trail. I was getting lost. The landscape, once so familiar, now seemed foreign. The trees had changed. The path was gone. I turned around, but I didn't recognize the way back. The more I tried to retrace my steps, the more everything felt off. The trees were no longer where they had been. The clearing I had passed through earlier was nowhere in sight. I was surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar trunks, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I was lost. I didn't panic immediately. There was no point. I had been in the woods enough to know the first rule. Don't panic, because panic only makes things worse. But deep down, I felt a growing fear. The air had gotten colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The shadows were longer now, and the silence had returned, deeper, heavier than before. I heard something, a snap of a twig, sharp and sudden. I froze. It was faint, but it was there, somewhere to my left. I turned in that direction, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more trees, the same dark shapes looming in the dusk. I took a deep breath and kept moving, trying to remain calm, trying to convince myself that the boy was still out there. Maybe he was lost too. Maybe we'd find each other. But as I walked on, the tracks grew more erratic. The circles grew tighter, spiraling toward a single point. I found myself following the prints to the base of an old, gnarled oak. The ground around it was disturbed. The earth churned as if something had been dug up. And there, lying in the dirt, was a small, torn scrap of cloth. It was the same fabric as before, the shirt from earlier. But now I wasn't sure whether it was the boy's shirt or something else. That's when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. I stood there, my breath coming fast now, sweat forming on the back of my neck. The fear that had been creeping up on me finally took hold, and I realized that I wasn't just following the boy anymore. I had been led somewhere I shouldn't be. The footsteps had been my own. The sound of the earth shifting, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That had been me all along. But this was different. The circles in the mud, the strange pattern, the feeling of being watched. It all clicked. I wasn't chasing the boy. I had been chasing something else. Something that had led me in circles, making me think I was searching for a lost child when all along, I was just getting deeper into its trap. I took a step back, my mind racing, and then I stopped. The realization hit me hard. There was no child. The prints were a trick, a distraction. Something had been manipulating me, leading me further into the woods, away from safety, away from help. I took another step back, then turned, my feet moving faster as I retraced my steps. This time, for real. I wasn't looking for a child. I was looking for my way out. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. The forest felt like it was swallowing me whole. I could hear my heartbeat now, pounding in my chest, as I pushed through the underbrush. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. Every rustle in the leaves sent a surge of adrenaline through my body. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and saw the edge of the forest. The familiar road was ahead of me, just beyond the line of trees. I didn't stop. I ran. I didn't look back until I was safely at the edge of the woods, gasping for breath. The missing child? I never found him, but I found something else that day. Something I couldn't explain. Something I'd never be able to forget. Maybe the boy had never been lost at all. Maybe I had been the one lost from the start. But whatever it was that led me into the forest, I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back. It was late afternoon when Jake and I reached the peak of the ridge. The air was thin, and the mountain's cool breeze hit us with the kind of refreshment that only comes after a long hike. The view was stunning. The whole valley spread out beneath us like a patchwork quilt of forests and fields. But as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, I felt a creeping unease. There was something off about the trail we were on. It didn't quite match what we had seen on the map earlier that day. Jake and I had been friends since college, both of us avid hikers, but this was our first time tackling the rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We'd spent the day following a trail marked on the map, but the farther we went, the more disorienting the landscape became. It didn't help that the GPS signal kept flickering in and out, especially as we descended into thicker, denser forest. The map had been a lifeline up to that point, but now it felt almost useless. We stopped to check our coordinates. Jake fiddled with his phone, but the signal was practically non-existent. He looked at me, brows furrowed, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't the trail we had planned on. "I think we missed something," he muttered, looking around at the dense trees that now crowded the path. I nodded, glancing at the surroundings. The trail was definitely changing. The narrow path we had followed for hours had split several times, each new direction confusing us more. The map showed a single route, but here, there were multiple forks that didn't match anything on the paper. The trees were thickening, and a chill was creeping into the air. It was becoming harder to see as the shadows lengthened. I pulled out the map again, trying to make sense of it. The ink was faded, and there was no clear way to match our current location to the map's marked paths. A few trails seemed to have disappeared altogether, replaced by overgrown patches of brambles and tall grass. Others led to dead ends or twisted back in the opposite direction, leaving us no clearer on how to find our way back. I felt the familiar pang of worry settle in my chest. The sun was almost gone, and we were well into the unknown now. The mountain's terrain wasn't forgiving, and with every passing minute, the shadows stretched longer and darker. We could hear the distant call of some birds, but other than that, the forest had grown eerily quiet. A deep, unsettling silence that seemed to press in on us. Jake was pacing back and forth now, muttering under his breath as he checked his phone again. "I don't like this. We should have turned back sooner." I nodded, But there was no turning back now. We were too far into the woods, and heading back the way we came wasn't a guaranteed solution. In fact, I wasn't even sure which way that was anymore. The trail had become a maze of conflicting directions, and the fading light made it even harder to navigate. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his voice tight. He wasn't used to being in this kind of situation. Neither of us were. "We need to make a decision. Either we set up camp here for the night and try to figure this out in the morning, or we keep moving, hoping to find something familiar," I said, feeling the weight of the moment. Neither choice was ideal. Staying out here overnight meant more risk. Wild animals, colder temperatures, and the possibility that we might make things worse. But continuing in the dark was equally dangerous. We could easily get more lost. "Let's keep going," Jake said finally, his voice determined, but I could hear the uncertainty there too. He was just as scared as I was. "We can't just sit here. Maybe we'll find something soon." We packed up our gear, keeping our voices low, trying not to let the anxiety in our chests show. The decision had been made, and now we had to follow through. But with every step, the forest grew darker, the trees pressing in tighter. The sounds of the wilderness had quieted even further, and it felt as if we were the only two people on Earth. It was at least an hour later when the first real sign of trouble showed itself. We had been walking for what felt like forever, but every direction we tried led us deeper into the woods. We came across another fork in the path, one we hadn't seen on the map at all. It didn't feel right, nothing did anymore. "That wasn't here before," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar path. I could barely make out the outline of the trail, barely distinguishable in the failing light. The trees had closed in completely, blocking most of the sky above. I glanced at my watch. It was already past 8 p.m. We had been on the move for hours. My legs ached, and the back of my neck tingled with a strange sense of dread. "Maybe we should just make camp here," I suggested. "We can't keep going like this. It's too dark to find anything now." Jake hesitated. "I guess you're right. Let's set up before it gets any worse." The air had grown colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine as we made camp. We set up our tents as quickly as possible, trying to keep calm, but the forest seemed to press in closer as we worked. Once everything was set up, we huddled together, sitting on the ground with our backs to the fire, listening to the sounds of the night around us. But there was something unsettling about the silence. The forest was too still, too quiet. It wasn't natural. There should have been the usual sounds, crickets, owls, maybe the rustling of animals in the underbrush. But it felt as if everything had gone completely still. We ate what little food we had left, trying to keep our minds off the growing sense of unease. But the darkness was oppressive, the kind of darkness that seems to stretch on forever, swallowing every trace of light. As the fire crackled, I glanced over at Jake. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around nervously. He knew, just like I did, that something was wrong. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we both fell into a restless sleep. But the night didn't pass quietly. The sounds that had been absent for so long suddenly returned, but they weren't comforting. It was as if something was moving out there in the woods, just beyond the edge of our firelight. A shifting in the trees, a rustle in the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something out there watching. The night stretched on forever, and neither of us slept much. The next morning, we packed up quickly. The daylight was a relief, but it didn't change the fact that we were still lost. I tried the GPS again, but it was still useless. We had to trust our instincts now, the map long forgotten. We retraced our steps, slowly and cautiously, but nothing felt familiar. Every tree, every path seemed like it belonged to a different world. Then, just as we were about to give up hope, we stumbled upon a small clearing. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the forest, another confusing path that led nowhere. But as we stepped closer, I saw it. A cabin. A small, wooden cabin, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't anywhere. But there it was, standing alone in the clearing, its walls weathered and aged. The door was slightly ajar, and the roof had seen better days, but it was a cabin, and it was real. We didn't know what to do. The place was empty, abandoned, and there was no telling how long it had been sitting there. But it was shelter, and we needed it. We stepped inside cautiously, the air inside musty and cold. It felt like stepping back in time. The old furniture covered in dust, the remnants of a life long gone. We stayed there until we could find our way back out. It wasn't the end of the nightmare, but it was the beginning of the end. The cabin had provided us with something we hadn't expected: hope. By the next morning, we had figured out our bearings and made our way back to safety. We had wandered too far, but we had found our way home. It was supposed to be an easy hike, just a quick trip up into the foothills near a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest. I'd been on this trail before, and I knew it well enough to trust my instincts. But somewhere along the way, I made a wrong turn. One wrong step, and it led me off course. I had come to the trailhead at sunrise, eager to clear my head. The air was crisp, and the trees, tall and straight like sentinels, seemed to pull me deeper into the woods with every step. There wasn't much to the path at first. A dirt trail wide enough for two people to walk side by side, soft underfoot with the occasional puddle from the morning dew. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. It was peaceful, like the kind of morning that makes you forget about everything outside of nature. The first mile passed without issue, and I reached the fork in the trail. Normally, I would have taken the right path. It was the one that looped around a small lake where I liked to sit and rest. But I found my mind wandering. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the ground. A small sign at the junction pointed left toward a trail I hadn't seen before. Unmarked. It read in faint letters. I'd never noticed it before, but it looked well enough used. I wondered if maybe it led to something new, something I hadn't explored yet. So, on a whim, I decided to take it. The first few hundred yards were easy enough. The trail was narrower than the one I'd been following, but still passable. It wound through dense trees that blocked out the sun, leaving only slivers of light filtering down. As I walked, I felt a slight thrill of excitement. I was off the beaten path, away from the crowds of hikers that usually followed the main route. It was just me and the forest now. But the further I went, the more the trail seemed to narrow, the ground beneath my boots becoming uneven. Soon, it became a series of loose rocks and thick underbrush. It didn't feel quite like a trail anymore, but I had come so far, and it seemed silly to turn back now. After all, I was an experienced hiker used to rough terrain. I could handle it. The next hour was filled with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching on the ground, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional bird call. The deeper I went, the more I began to wonder where this trail was taking me. It wasn't like any of the maps I'd seen. The trees seemed denser here, the forest more enclosed. I hadn't seen any markers for a while. I wasn't sure if the trail had even been maintained recently. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, it was too late. The trail had completely disappeared. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the area around me. The forest looked the same in every direction: dense, green, and unyielding. I tried to follow the path I thought I'd been on, but it was hopeless. There were no more clear signs of a trail, no more footprints, nothing that made sense. The only thing that remained were the trees, the rocks, and the growing silence. A twinge of panic crept into my chest. I was lost. It's a terrifying realization, one that creeps up on you slowly, At first, you think you can just retrace your steps. But with each turn, with each look around, the world around you starts to blur. It starts to feel like the forest is closing in. I tried to calm myself. It was still early enough in the day that I had time to figure this out. I took out my phone to check for a signal, but as I expected, there was none. The trees and hills around me blocked everything. I thought about marking the trees, making my own trail, but the landscape here was dense. Every direction seemed the same, and the more I wandered, the less sure I became. As the afternoon wore on, the sky started to dim. The trees had blocked most of the sun by now, and the light was fading fast. That's when I saw the first marker. A tree scarred deeply in the shape of a long vertical line. It wasn't natural. Whoever had made that mark had done it with purpose. I approached cautiously, unsure of what it meant, but I wasn't going to leave it unexplored. Maybe it was a sign. Someone else had been here. I continued walking, following what I hoped was some kind of direction. The light was almost gone now, and the shadows were thickening, stretching long across the ground. I tried to move faster, but every step felt more uncertain. The trail, if it even was a trail anymore, had become a mere suggestion. The markers grew more frequent, but they didn't seem to lead anywhere. There was something strange about them. The carvings in the trees were inconsistent, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep. The rocks piled in odd shapes, like they were placed there intentionally. At times, I think I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. Still, the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone kept growing. I stumbled over a large rock and caught myself before falling. As I did, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. The marks were faint, but unmistakable. Someone had been here recently. My heart skipped a beat. Were they still here? Had I been following them? Or had they been following me? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I felt the weight of the growing darkness settling in. It was getting harder to see, and the air was thickening with the onset of evening. I had no choice but to keep moving. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Safety, shelter, or just the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. But the trail kept getting harder to follow. There were no signs, no landmarks, just trees, rocks, and the unsettling quiet of the forest. My body ached from the effort, and my mind was beginning to fray. Every turn felt wrong, and each step deeper into the woods felt like a step away from finding my way back. By now, I was completely disoriented. The markers were no help, and the path seemed to disappear with every step. I stopped and took a breath, trying to steady myself. My stomach was tight with nerves, my thoughts racing. I had to keep my head clear, but with each passing minute, the feeling of being watched grew. I wasn't just lost, I was being watched. I stopped again, scanning the trees. There, just out of sight, a flash of movement. Something or someone was there. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, trying to push the fear down, but it was hard. The forest seemed to close in on me. There was a sense of pressure, an invisible weight pushing in from all sides. I forced myself to stay calm, but my mind kept racing. My breathing became shallow. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw something ahead. A break in the trees. Clearing. I didn't hesitate. I pushed forward, stepping into the open space. And then I saw it. A small cabin tucked away at the edge of the forest. It wasn't much, but it was real. A shelter. I ran toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I could see the windows were dark. No signs of life. I didn't care. I needed shelter. I needed safety. I reached for the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened with a creak. Inside, it was just a simple, rundown cabin. Dust covered the floors, and there was a faint smell of wood and mildew in the air. But it was a place to rest, a place to catch my breath. I didn't know who had built this cabin or why it was here, but at that moment, it was my salvation. I locked the door behind me, not that it would have made much of a difference. I didn't feel completely safe, not really, but the cabin was a place to stop, to collect myself. I found an old chair by the window and sat down. As the night settled in, I kept my eyes on the forest outside. The stillness of the woods pressed against the cabin walls, and somewhere, in the distance, I thought I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't get any closer. By morning, I was ready to leave the cabin behind. I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten here, but the woods felt different now. The fear that had followed me seemed to vanish as I stepped back onto the trail. I retraced my steps carefully, marking trees and rocks as best I could. By mid-morning, I finally found the familiar path again. It was as if the woods had let me go. I made my way back to the main trail, exhausted but grateful. As I reached the trailhead, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder at the woods. They were still there, silent, waiting, as if they knew I'd be back one day. But for now, I was safe. Through the ashes, it was late September when I decided to hike the Cypress Ridge Trail. The area had been closed for over a year after a wildfire swept through the region, leaving a charred landscape that many locals, including myself, had avoided. I grew up in the small town of Elmsford, Montana, just a few miles from the ridge. As a kid, I spent countless weekends exploring these woods, building forts, and pretending I was an adventurer. Now, at 32, I felt an urge to return. Not just to reconnect with those memories, but to see how the forest was beginning to heal. My dog, Max, a 5-year-old Labrador mix, trotted beside me as I parked at the trailhead. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of damp earth, a welcome change from the lingering summer heat. The sign marking the entrance to the trail was new, its wood unstained by time, with a notice underneath warning hikers to stay on the marked path due to unstable terrain and potential wildlife encounters. The first hour was promising. New growth had begun to sprout between the blackened trunks of trees, a vivid green against the stark black and gray of the burned forest. Birds flitted between branches, their calls echoing in the stillness. I stopped occasionally to snap photos with my camera, noting how life was slowly reclaiming the scarred landscape. But as I ventured farther, the trail became harder to follow. Many of the old landmarks I remembered, like the large moss-covered boulder near the stream, were either gone or unrecognizable. The fire had reshaped the land, leaving behind a patchwork of ash, rocks, and young saplings. I reassured myself that I was following the markers nailed to the trees, though some were faded or missing entirely. Around midday, I reached what I thought was the halfway point, a clearing with a view of the valley below. It was breathtaking. The charred forest stretched out for miles, with patches of green starting to dot the landscape. I unpacked a sandwich and a water bottle, sharing bits of the bread with Max. He wagged his tail, oblivious to my growing unease about how disoriented I felt. By the time I decided to head back, the sun was already starting its slow descent. The light filtered through the trees in long golden beams, but it also cast deeper shadows that made the path harder to distinguish. I retraced my steps as best as I could, but nothing looked familiar. The markers were few and far between, and my confidence started to waver. Max began acting strangely, too. He would pause, ears perked, staring into the dense thickets as if he heard something I couldn't. At first, I brushed it off as a squirrel or a bird, but his behavior became more erratic. He growled low and deep at one point, which was unlike him. I knelt down and stroked his fur, trying to calm him, and myself. Then my phone died. I had been using it sparingly, saving it for emergencies, but apparently not sparingly enough. I cursed under my breath, shoved it back into my pocket, and looked up at the sky. The sun was sinking faster now, and the air had grown noticeably cooler. Panic was a slow, creeping sensation in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. I had Max, I had my flashlight, and I had enough food and water for the night if it came to that. I decided to follow the slope downhill. In my experience, trails often led to streams or roads at lower elevations. But the forest was a maze, and every direction looked the same. The burned-out stumps and fallen trees created a jagged, alien landscape that felt more like a trap than an escape. As darkness settled, I turned on my flashlight and kept moving. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Max stayed close to my side, his usual enthusiasm replaced by quiet vigilance. I kept talking to him softly, more for my benefit than his. Around 9 p.m., I stumbled upon what looked like an old campsite. The fire ring was barely discernible, a circle of blackened stones covered in ash and debris. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of relief. I gathered some dry branches and managed to start a small fire, the crackling flames offering a tiny island of light and warmth in the vast darkness. Max lay down beside me, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed alert. I ate a granola bar and sipped water, my thoughts racing. Every sound in the forest felt amplified: the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the usual noises of the woods, but Max's occasional growls suggested otherwise. The night dragged on. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt vulnerable, exposed. The fire was my only comfort, though I knew it wouldn't last long without more wood. I debated whether to venture out to gather more, but the thought of leaving the small circle of light was terrifying. At some point, Max stood up suddenly, his body rigid. He stared into the darkness, growling low and deep. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction he was looking. The beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground and unmoving. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized it was a coyote, or perhaps a small wolf. I yelled, waving the flashlight and throwing a stick in its direction. The eyes disappeared, and I heard the sound of it retreating into the brush. Max barked after it, but I pulled him close, not wanting him to chase whatever it was. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. I kept the fire going as long as I could, dozing off in short bursts. By dawn, the forest was bathed in pale, cold light. I felt a surge of determination to keep moving. I headed downhill again, using the rising sun as my guide. Max seemed more energetic, his tail wagging as he sniffed the air. It wasn't long before I heard the faint sound of rushing water. Following the noise, I stumbled upon a creek, clear and bubbling, a lifeline in the middle of the wilderness. I knew that creeks often led to larger rivers or roads, so I decided to follow it. The going was slow, with uneven terrain and fallen logs blocking the way, but the sound of the water kept me focused. By midday, I saw something that made my knees go weak: a dirt road cutting through the forest. It wasn't wide, but it was unmistakably man-made. I followed it for what felt like hours before I heard the distant hum of an engine. A park ranger's truck came into view, and I waved my arms frantically. The ranger, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stopped and rolled down his window. "You okay?" he asked. Relief washed over me as I explained what had happened. He gave me water and offered to drive me back to the trailhead. Max jumped into the truck eagerly, his tail wagging furiously. As we drove, the ranger told me that the area was still recovering from the fire and that many hikers had reported getting lost recently. The markers were being replaced, but it was a slow process. When I finally reached my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The forest had changed, and so had I. It wasn't the place of my childhood anymore, but it was still alive, still growing. As I drove home with Max snoozing in the back seat, I promised myself I'd return, better prepared next time. I never thought I'd regret pursuing my love for geology, but the events in Coyote Gulch that summer changed me forever. The summer of 2016 was one of the hottest on record in Utah, and the desert air seemed to shimmer with heat even at dawn. I was 25 at the time, an ambitious grad student working on my geology thesis. My goal? To study the unique sandstone formations deep within a little explored part of Coyote Gulch. That morning, I left camp before the sun crested the horizon, hoping to beat the heat. My pack was light. A few tools, notebooks, a small first aid kit, and 2 liters of water. It didn't feel like enough, but I figured I'd be back by midday. I'd done my research on the area. There was no official trail, but satellite maps showed a clear path through the canyon. As the sun climbed higher, I made good progress. The towering walls of the canyon seemed to glow red and orange, their curves like frozen waves in the rock. I stopped occasionally to take photos and jot down notes. The rock here was fascinating. Ripples of fine sandstone layered with quartz veins, some sections embedded with ancient fossils. I felt a quiet thrill knowing I was probably the only person to study these formations in detail. By mid-morning, the sun was relentless, and the shade in the canyon had all but disappeared. I kept moving deeper, following the narrowing path as it wound between walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the rocky ground. I found a shaded overhang and decided to take a break. Pulling out my water bottle, I took a few sips, enough to quench my thirst but not too much. I had to ration it. The temperature was climbing into the triple digits, and I still had hours of hiking ahead. That's when I heard it. A low rumble, distant but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was a jet overhead, but the sound grew louder, closer. I stood up, scanning the canyon walls, and my stomach dropped. A section of rock high above me had started to give way. Shit! I yelled, instinctively bolting to the side. The rumble became a roar as boulders, dirt, and smaller rocks tumbled down. I crouched under the overhang, pressing myself against the wall, feeling the vibration of the earth beneath me. The dust was overwhelming, filling the air and stinging my eyes. When the noise finally stopped, the canyon was silent again, but the path ahead of me was gone. I stepped out cautiously, coughing into my sleeve as the dust settled. A massive pile of debris now blocked the way forward. A jagged wall of boulders, loose dirt, and shattered sandstone. The rock slide had completely filled the narrow canyon ahead. My heart pounded as I realized the gravity of my situation. I turned to look back the way I'd come, hoping to retrace my steps, but the ground behind me had shifted too. The path was unstable, with loose rocks teetering precariously. One wrong step and I could trigger another slide. I was trapped. For a moment, panic set in. I paced back and forth, my breathing shallow. I told my advisor I'd be out here, but no one knew exactly where I'd gone. Even if they sent a search party, it could be days before anyone found me. I had my phone, but there was no signal this deep in the canyon. "Calm down, Ryan," I muttered to myself. "Think." I forced myself to sit down and assess my situation. I had less than half a liter of water left and no food, but I wasn't injured. My pack contained basic supplies, including a pocket knife and a small flashlight. The sun was high overhead now, and the heat was unbearable. I needed to conserve my energy. The overhang where I'd taken cover provided some shade, so I decided to stay there for now. I used my knife to scrape loose dirt and rocks into a crude seat and leaned against the cool rock wall. I tried to come up with a plan, but my thoughts kept drifting to worst-case scenarios. What if I couldn't get out? What if I ran out of water? As the afternoon dragged on, I explored my immediate surroundings, searching for any way to climb over or around the debris. The rock slide had created an unstable, almost vertical slope, and every attempt to climb it dislodged more rocks. The canyon walls were sheer and offered no footholds. I was trapped in what felt like a natural tomb. By evening, the temperature began to drop, and the shadows grew longer. I tried to distract myself by jotting notes in my journal, but my hand shook with dehydration and exhaustion. My water was almost gone. I rationed the last few sips, knowing I'd need to save some for the next day. The night was cold and eerily silent. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to stay warm, and dozed off in short bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of water, streams, lakes, even the condensation on a cold glass. When I woke at dawn, my mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. I knew I couldn't stay there another day. The heat would kill me if thirst didn't. I decided to try climbing the unstable slope again. Using my knife, I carved small holes into the dirt, testing each one carefully before pulling myself up. It was grueling work. Every few feet, I had to stop and catch my breath, my muscles trembling with effort. About halfway up, the ground beneath me gave way. I slid down several feet, scraping my hands and knees on the rocks. Blood mixed with dirt, but I forced myself to keep going. My vision blurred from the heat, and my head throbbed, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself die here. Hours later, I reached the top of the debris pile. The sight of the open canyon ahead nearly brought me to tears. I stumbled forward, my legs barely holding me up, and kept moving. I didn't have a clear plan, just a desperate need to find help. As the sun climbed higher, I began to feel dizzy and disoriented. The canyon walls seemed to blur together, and I tripped over rocks more than once. My water was gone, and the heat was unbearable. I knew I was close to collapse. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw something that didn't seem real. A small patch of green. A spring, trickling out from the base of the canyon wall, fed a tiny oasis of grass and shrubs. I dropped to my knees and drank deeply, the cold water reviving me almost instantly. I stayed by the spring for hours, resting in the shade and slowly rehydrating. When I felt strong enough, I continued down the canyon, following the sound of the stream as it grew into a small creek. Eventually, the canyon widened, and I spotted the faint outline of a dirt road in the distance. By the time I reached the road, I was barely conscious. A group of hikers found me and gave me food and water before driving me to the nearest town. It took weeks for me to recover fully, but I never forgot the lessons I learned in Coyote Gulch. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. And no matter how much you prepare, sometimes survival comes down to sheer determination and a little luck. Our family of 4 had decided it was time to disconnect from the hum of everyday life. The constant pings and buzzes of our devices had begun to replace real conversations. So, we left our screens behind and headed into the Appalachian wilderness for a weekend of camping. It was late October, and the trees were in their fiery glory, reds, oranges, and yellows carpeting the mountainsides. My wife, Karen, and I had planned this trip as a way to reconnect with our 2 teenagers, Sophie and Nate, before the cold settled in. Sophie, at 14, had started to roll her eyes at family activities, while Nate, just 12, was still eager but more interested in video games than nature. We picked a remote campsite at the base of Hawk Ridge, a place we'd read about online. It was supposed to have breathtaking views at sunrise, and I figured the site might inspire the kids to appreciate the outdoors. We arrived in the early afternoon, unloaded our gear, and set up camp. The air was crisp, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. Nate and I struggled with the tent poles while Sophie complained about bugs. But eventually, we had a solid setup. After a quick lunch of sandwiches and trail mix, Karen suggested we hike to the ridge to check out the view and get a lay of the land before tomorrow's sunrise trek. I hesitated. The sun was already sinking low, and I wasn't sure we'd have enough daylight. But the trailhead was only a short walk from camp, and everyone seemed eager to stretch their legs. So we grabbed our water bottles, a flashlight just in case, and set off. The trail was steep but well-marked. It wound through dense woods, where the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streaks. Sophie led the way, her ponytail bouncing as she moved. Nate stayed close behind me, occasionally kicking at loose stones and asking how much farther. Karen, ever the optimist, kept pointing out interesting plants and birds, even though neither of the kids paid much attention. About halfway up, the air began to change. A chill crept in, and the light started to dim faster than I'd expected. Karen noticed it too. "Let's not linger," she said, her voice calm but firm. The ridge was supposed to be about a mile and a half up, and I figured we could make it there and back with time to spare before dark. But then the fog rolled in. It was sudden, like a gray curtain had been pulled over the mountain. One moment we could see the trail stretching ahead, and the next, everything beyond a few feet was swallowed up. Sophie stopped abruptly, causing Nate to bump into her. "What the heck?" he muttered, his voice unusually tense. "Stay close," I said, trying to keep my own nerves in check. The fog was thick and cold, clinging to our skin. It muffled the forest sounds, making everything eerily quiet. I pulled out the flashlight and clicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the haze. Karen suggested we turn back, and I agreed. But as we retraced our steps, the trail seemed less familiar. The trees loomed closer, their trunks like ghostly figures in the fog. Nate stumbled over a root, and I reached out to steady him. That's when Sophie spoke up, her voice trembling. "This doesn't look right," she said. I wanted to reassure her, but she was right. The trail markers we'd been following, small, painted blazes on the trees, were nowhere to be seen. We pressed on, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but the fog made every direction look the same. The sense of disorientation was overwhelming. I tried to keep track of the slope, thinking downhill would eventually lead us back to camp, but the ground beneath us seemed to shift unpredictably, sometimes steep, sometimes flat. Then came the fall. Nate, rushing to catch up after lagging behind, slipped on a patch of damp leaves. His ankle twisted with a sickening pop, and he cried out in pain. Karen and I knelt beside him, assessing the damage. His ankle was already swelling, and he couldn't put any weight on it without wincing. Karen tore a strip from her jacket to wrap it as a makeshift brace, but it was clear we'd have to slow down. I hoisted Nate onto my back, his arms around my shoulders, and we continued. Sophie clutched Karen's hand tightly, her earlier bravado gone. The fog showed no sign of lifting, and I felt a growing knot of dread in my stomach. We walked for what felt like hours. The flashlight's beam grew weaker, and the chill seeped deeper into our bones. Sophie started to cry quietly, her tears streaking down her pale cheeks. Karen whispered words of comfort to her, though I could barely hear them over the sound of my own labored breathing. At one point, the ground leveled out and I thought we'd found a clearing. But as we moved forward, I realized we were perilously close to a drop-off. The fog hid the bottom, but I could feel the void in front of us, a vast, empty space. "Back, back," I urged, my voice sharp. We edged away, hearts pounding. Exhaustion set in. Nate was heavy on my back, and my legs felt like lead. Karen suggested we stop and wait for the fog to lift, but the cold made staying still unbearable. We had no choice but to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled onto something familiar, a fallen tree we'd passed earlier in the hike. Relief washed over me. From there, I managed to piece together the direction of the trail. Step by step, we made our way down, the fog thinning as we descended. By the time we reached the base, the air was clearer, and the lights from our campsite were visible through the trees. Collapsing by the fire pit, we huddled together for warmth, too drained to speak. Nate's ankle would need proper attention, but for now we were safe. The fog still lingered in patches, swirling among the trees like a reminder of how close we'd come to disaster. That night, as I lay in the tent listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of how fragile our safety had been. Nature, in all its beauty, had reminded us of its power. I still can't believe how reckless we were. It was the spring of 2019, and my best friend, Ethan, and I had been planning our trip to Arizona for months. We'd grown up together in Wisconsin, bonded over late-night gaming sessions and long hikes through the woods near my family's cabin. But we were both craving something more adventurous, something that would push us out of our comfort zones. That's how we ended up deciding to explore a network of lava tubes in a national park just outside Flagstaff. Neither of us was an experienced caver. We weren't complete novices either. We'd done plenty of research, watched videos online, and even practiced basic climbing techniques at the local gym. Ethan had invested in a sturdy backpack, and I'd picked up a high-quality flashlight. But looking back, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. The morning we set out was crisp and bright. The park's entrance was buzzing with tourists, families snapping pictures, and retirees shuffling along well-marked trails. We felt invincible, fueled by the thrill of doing something different, something most of those people wouldn't dare attempt. Ethan and I had read about the lava tubes in a geology magazine, captivated by descriptions of their eerie beauty. Walls glistening with minerals, narrow passages opening into vast underground chambers. By the time we reached the entrance to the tubes, the crowd had thinned. The opening was a gaping black hole in the earth, rimmed with jagged rocks and partially hidden by scraggly desert shrubs. A small sign warned visitors to proceed at their own risk, but we didn't think twice. We snapped a quick photo, joking about how hardcore we looked in our cheap hiking boots and secondhand backpacks. The first 100 feet were easy. The tube sloped gently downward, and sunlight filtered in just enough to illuminate the rocky floor. Ethan, always the more confident one, led the way, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I followed close behind, adjusting the straps on my backpack and marveling at the strange, otherworldly formations around us. The walls were smooth in some places, sharp and craggy in others, with streaks of reddish-brown that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them just right. "This is incredible," Ethan said, his voice echoing slightly. "Can you imagine what it must have been like when this was an active lava flow?" I nodded, too awestruck to respond. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the dry heat above ground. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching on loose gravel and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep in the cave. We kept going, deeper and deeper, until the entrance was nothing more than a pinprick of light behind us. The tube twisted and branched off in several directions, and we had to stop more than once to check the map we'd printed out. It wasn't detailed, just a rough sketch we'd found on a hiking forum, but it was better than nothing. Or so we thought. About an hour in, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the oppressive darkness or the way the walls seemed to close in the farther we went. It was the realization that we were completely alone down here. No park rangers, no fellow adventurers, just us and miles of twisting, unfamiliar tunnels. "You think we should head back soon?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. Ethan glanced at his watch. "We've got plenty of time. Let's see if we can find that big chamber the guide mentioned. It's supposed to be just up ahead." Reluctantly, I agreed. The chamber was supposedly the highlight of the tube. A massive cavern with a ceiling so high you could barely see it, dotted with strange rock formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. I didn't want to be the one to chicken out before we reached it, but as we pressed on, something went wrong. The tunnel forked again and again, and the map became less and less useful. The walls started to look the same, endless stretches of rough, black rock, broken only by the occasional patch of moss or glint of quartz. "Wait," I said, stopping to catch my breath. "Are we going the right way?" Ethan turned, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. "I think so. The chamber should be just ahead. Let's keep going a little farther." We walked for another 15 minutes, then another 30. The chamber never appeared. Instead, the tunnel seemed to narrow, the ceiling dropping lower until we had to stoop to avoid hitting our heads. "This doesn't feel right," I said. "We should have turned back by now." Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, maybe you're right. Let's backtrack." But backtracking wasn't as simple as it sounded. Without the sunlight to guide us, every tunnel looked identical. We tried following the map, retracing our steps as best we could, but it was no use. The passages twisted and looped back on themselves, leading us in circles. Panic started to set in. My flashlight flickered, then dimmed, the beam barely reaching a few feet ahead. Ethan's was still working, but his batteries wouldn't last forever. We hadn't brought extras, another oversight in a long list of mistakes. "Okay, don't freak out," Ethan said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "We'll find our way out. We just need to stay calm." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, calm. Got it." But staying calm was easier said than done. The tunnels seemed to close in around us, the silence broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional scrape of a rock underfoot. My legs ached, my mouth was dry, and my head throbbed from the constant tension. We kept moving, hoping against hope that we'd stumble upon something familiar. A marker we'd passed earlier, a patch of sunlight filtering in from above. But the deeper we went, the more I realized how hopeless our situation was. Hours passed, though it felt like days. We stopped to rest a few times, sitting on the cold, damp ground and rationing the water and snacks we'd brought. But the breaks didn't help. Every time we got up to keep searching, my legs felt heavier, my mind foggier. At some point, Ethan's flashlight died. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. We fumbled for my phone, using its weak glow to light our way, but the battery was already low. "I don't think we're getting out of here tonight," Ethan said quietly. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. We decided to stop and conserve our energy, hoping that daylight, or the faint sound of voices from the surface, might guide us in the morning. We huddled together for warmth, the rock beneath us leaching the heat from our bodies. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the endless tunnels, heard the echo of our footsteps, felt the crushing weight of the earth above us. When morning came, if it even was morning, we started moving again. The phone's battery died shortly after, leaving us in total darkness. We felt our way along the walls, our fingers scraping against the rough rock. I lost track of time, of direction, of everything but the overwhelming need to find the surface. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not when the alternative was dying down here, lost and forgotten. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Do you see that?" He didn't respond, but I could feel him moving beside me, drawn to the same glimmer of hope. We stumbled toward the light, our movements clumsy and desperate. It grew brighter, sharper, until we realized what it was. The mouth of the cave. The relief was overwhelming. We collapsed onto the rocky ground outside, gasping for air, the sunlight blinding after so many hours in the dark. A group of hikers found us not long after, alerted by our cries for help. They called for a ranger who helped us back to the trailhead. I don't know how we survived. We should have died down there, lost in the labyrinth of tunnels. But somehow we made it out. I haven't been back to a cave since. I don't think I ever will. I was 54 when I decided to take the trek. It had been 3 years since my wife, Helen, had passed away. Hiking had been her passion, her escape from the world's noise. We used to hike together whenever we could. Her favorite trails were deep in the forests of Washington, untouched and wild. After she passed, I avoided those trails. It felt too painful to walk them without her. But something changed this year. Maybe it was time or the fact that grief never truly leaves, but you learn to live alongside it. I felt ready to go back to the wilderness, to honor her love for the trails she cherished. I chose late June for the trek. The days were long, and the summer warmth softened the edges of the mountain chill. I packed light, a sturdy backpack with a sleeping bag, a small tent, some dried food, water, a knife, and my old service pistol. I didn't plan on using it, I'd never had to, but it was a habit ingrained from my years in the army. As I strapped on my boots that morning, the weight of what I was about to do sank in. This wasn't just a hike. It was a goodbye to the part of me still anchored to grief. I started early, just as the sun broke over the tree line. The first stretch of the trail was gentle, weaving through tall pines and firs. The smell of damp earth and the soft rustle of leaves felt familiar, comforting even. The quiet out here wasn't empty. It was alive with birdsong and the occasional crack of a branch under a squirrel's weight. I fell into a rhythm quickly, the crunch of my boots on the trail setting a steady pace. By midday, I had covered several miles and stopped to eat near a small creek. The cold water refreshed me as I splashed my face and filled my bottle. Helen would have loved this spot. I could almost hear her voice pointing out the wildflowers along the bank. It made me smile, but it also left a hollow ache in my chest. I pushed the feeling aside and kept moving. I had a lot of ground to cover before setting up camp for the night. The terrain grew rougher as the afternoon wore on. The trail narrowed, the trees closing in around me. It was the kind of isolation I had been looking for. No people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. The first sign was a set of tracks. At first glance, they looked like a dog's. Large paw prints pressed into the dirt. But as I crouched to examine them, I realized they were too big and the claws too prominent. A mountain lion. My stomach tightened. I'd read about them before this trip. Solitary and elusive, they rarely attacked humans, but they were territorial and unpredictable. I stood and scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved. The forest was quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I told myself it was fine. The tracks looked old. The lion was probably long gone. Still, I kept my knife closer as I walked. An hour later, I saw the second sign. Claw marks raked across the bark of a tree just off the trail. These were fresh, the sap still wet and glistening. My breathing quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had been through worse in my life. This was just another challenge. I moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead and the dense underbrush around me. The feeling of being watched came soon after. It was subtle at first, an itch at the back of my mind. Then it grew impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, I would catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow slipping between the trees. I turned quickly, hoping to catch sight of whatever was there, but I saw nothing. I began to talk aloud, not because I expected an answer, but because I had read somewhere that noise could deter predators. "All right, buddy," I muttered, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest. "I see you. No need to come any closer." The sun was low by the time I decided to make camp. I found a clearing near a rock outcrop that gave me a view of the surrounding trees. It wasn't ideal, being exposed made me uneasy, but it was better than being hemmed in by forest on all sides. I set up my tent quickly, my hands fumbling as the shadows deepened. Every snap of a twig made me pause, my heart pounding. Dinner was a hurried affair. I ate some dried fruit and jerky, washing it down with water. I didn't light a fire. It felt safer to stay as inconspicuous as possible. As darkness fell, the sense of being stalked grew stronger. I couldn't shake the image of golden eyes watching me from the shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, my pistol within arm's reach. The forest came alive with nocturnal sounds. Owls hooting, the distant cry of a coyote, but none of them matched the low, guttural growl I heard around midnight. It was close, too close. I froze, my hand gripping the pistol. The growl didn't come again, but I knew the lion was out there. When dawn broke, I packed up quickly and moved on. My muscles ached from tension and lack of sleep, but I had no choice. The lion wasn't giving up. Its tracks crisscrossed the trail ahead of me, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I tried shouting, waving my arms, even throwing rocks into the underbrush, but nothing worked. The predator stayed hidden, always just out of sight. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs felt like lead, and my nerves were frayed. I reached a ridge with a steep drop-off on one side and dense forest on the other. It was risky, but I decided to follow the ridge. The open space on one side made it harder for the lion to approach unnoticed. That's when it happened. A sudden rustle behind me, louder than before. I spun around, my heart hammering. The lion stepped out of the trees, its body low to the ground, muscles rippling under its tawny coat. It was bigger than I expected. Its yellow eyes locked onto mine. Time seemed to slow. I raised the pistol, my hands shaking. The lion took a step forward, its movements deliberate and measured. I yelled, trying to make myself look bigger, but it didn't flinch. It was testing me, deciding if I was worth the effort. I fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed through the forest, startling birds from the trees. The lion stopped, its ears flattening. For a moment, I thought it would retreat, but then it crouched, its body coiled like a spring. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I backed away slowly, keeping the pistol trained on it. My foot slipped on loose gravel, and I nearly went over the edge of the ridge. The lion didn't charge, but it followed, keeping pace as I edged my way along the narrow path. Eventually, the ridge widened, and I spotted a cluster of large boulders ahead. They offered some elevation, a defensible position. I scrambled up onto the rocks, my hands scraping against the rough surface. The lion stopped at the base, its tail flicking back and forth. It knew I was trapped but couldn't reach me easily. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, a standoff in the fading light. My arms ached from holding the pistol, and my throat was dry from shouting. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lion seemed to lose interest. It turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me shaking and alone. I didn't move until the stars were out, too afraid it might return. When I finally climbed down, I made my way back to the trail as quickly as I could, not stopping until I reached a ranger station the next afternoon. They told me I was lucky. Most people don't walk away from an encounter like that. It was weeks before I could sleep through the night again, but I kept Helen's memory close, knowing she would have been proud of me for facing the wilderness, even if it nearly broke me. It was early spring, late March of 2018, when I decided to head into the canyons of Silver Ridge. The area was known for its rugged beauty, but more importantly, it was home to a rare species of warbler that nested there only during this time of year. As a wildlife photographer, these kinds of opportunities weren't just my passion, they were my livelihood. The forecast called for light rain, but nothing that concerned me. I'd hiked these canyons at least a dozen times, so I felt confident this would be a simple day trip. I packed light, just my camera gear, some snacks, water, and a compact first aid kit. I dressed in layers, thermal shirt, waterproof jacket, and hiking pants that would dry quickly if they got wet. My boots were sturdy and broken in, and I carried a lightweight trekking pole to help with stability on uneven terrain. By sunrise, I was already on the trail. The canyon was as beautiful as ever, the walls streaked with red and gold sandstone. The creek that ran through it babbled softly, its flow gentle and manageable. I kept my eyes peeled for movement in the trees, hoping to spot the warblers before the rain started. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mix of damp soil and budding leaves. As the hours passed, I ventured deeper into the canyon. The trail narrowed, and the walls on either side grew taller, looming above me like ancient sentinels. I found myself stopping often to photograph other wildlife. Deer tracks near the creek, a hawk perched on a dead tree, even a patch of bright green moss that seemed to glow in the dim light. It was peaceful, almost meditative. Around noon, the sky darkened, and a light drizzle began. I wasn't worried. The rain was gentle, just enough to make the air feel crisp and cool. I pulled up my hood and pressed on, hoping to reach a specific nesting area I'd scouted on a previous trip. The trail by then was little more than a series of rough steps carved into the rock, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. That's when I noticed the creek. The water, which had been a calm trickle earlier, was now moving faster, its surface choppy. It wasn't alarming yet, but it was enough to give me pause. I'd heard stories about flash floods in the region, how storms miles away could send walls of water roaring through these narrow canyons. But the rain here was so light, and the forecast hadn't mentioned anything severe. I told myself I'd just be cautious and keep an eye on it. Another hour passed, and the drizzle turned into steady rain. The creek was now a small river, rushing and foaming as it carved its way through the canyon floor. The sound of the water echoed off the walls, louder than I'd expected. My unease grew, but I was stubborn. I was close to the nesting site, and I didn't want to leave without getting the shots I'd come for. When I finally reached the site, I felt a brief moment of triumph. The birds were there, flitting between the branches of a twisted juniper tree clinging to the canyon wall. I set up my tripod and snapped photo after photo, adjusting my lens to capture every detail of their vibrant plumage. For a while, I forgot about the rain, lost in the thrill of my work. It wasn't until I packed up my gear and turned back toward the trail that I realized how much trouble I was in. The creek had transformed into a raging torrent. The narrow path I'd followed earlier was now underwater, and the current was too strong to wade through safely. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed higher ground, somewhere safe to wait until the water receded. I climbed up a rocky slope, my boots slipping on the wet stone. The rain was heavier now, falling in sheets that blurred my vision. Every step was a struggle, my hands scrambling for holds on the slick surface. At one point, a chunk of rock crumbled beneath my weight, sending me sliding back down several feet. My palms and knees stung where they scraped against the stone, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I found a narrow ledge about 15 feet above the water. It wasn't ideal, the rock was uneven, and there was barely enough space to sit, but it was the best option I had. I pressed my back against the canyon wall, my heart pounding as I looked down at the floodwaters churning below. The hours dragged by. The rain didn't let up, and the water continued to rise, inching closer to my precarious perch. My clothes were soaked through, and the cold seeped into my bones. I tried to eat a granola bar, but my hands were shaking too much to unwrap it. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. The ledge collapsing, the water sweeping me away, no one knowing where to find me. As the light began to fade, I knew I had to act. Staying on the ledge overnight wasn't an option, not with the water rising and the rock beneath me feeling less stable by the minute. I scanned the canyon walls, looking for any path that might lead to safety. About 20 feet away, I spotted a small overhang, higher up and slightly wider than where I was. It wasn't much, but it looked more secure. Getting there was another story. The gap between the ledge and the overhang was steep and slippery, with no clear footholds. I'd have to climb carefully, testing each step before committing to it. I took a deep breath and started moving. The first few steps were manageable, though my boots slid dangerously on the wet rock. I used my trekking pole to steady myself, planting it firmly before each step. About halfway across, the pole slipped, and I nearly lost my balance. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed onto a jagged rock, my fingers gripping it so tightly they ached. By the time I reached the overhang, my arms and legs felt like jelly. I collapsed onto the flat rock, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The overhang provided some shelter from the rain, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. I spent the night there, huddled against the cold. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the water rising or the rock giving way beneath me. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped, and the water level had begun to drop. It took another grueling day to make my way out of the canyon. The trail was gone, washed away by the flood, and I had to navigate using landmarks and sheer determination. When I finally emerged from the canyon, dirty, exhausted, and battered, I felt a surge of relief so intense it brought me to my knees. I never did get the perfect shot of the warblers, but I learned something far more valuable that day. Nature is beautiful, yes, but it's also unpredictable and unforgiving. You can prepare as much as you want, but sometimes you just have to respect its power and hope you're lucky enough to survive. I had been waiting months for this trip. Hiking and climbing were more than hobbies. They were my way of reconnecting with myself. After spending most of the year chained to a desk job in Portland, I finally took the time off I needed to challenge myself on a new trail. I'd read about it on a forum for climbers. A hidden gem in Colorado, not far from Estes Park, with a rugged path leading to an impressive rock formation. The area wasn't overly crowded, and the summit promised views that could rival anything in a National Geographic spread. The trail wasn't officially maintained by the Park Service, but that only added to its charm. It was for those who knew what they were doing, a step up from the well-marked loops with handrails and warning signs. I spent weeks preparing, studying the route, gathering gear, and getting back into climbing shape. At 34, I wasn't as spry as I had been in my 20s, but I was experienced. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. The morning of the climb, I parked my car at the edge of the forest where the dirt road ended and the trail began. It was late September, and the air was crisp, with just enough bite to keep me alert. My backpack was loaded with the essentials: a couple of liters of water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a lightweight emergency blanket. I even brought my climbing helmet, overkill for the route, but better safe than sorry. The first few hours of the hike were incredible. The trail wove through dense pines, occasionally opening up to reveal panoramic views of the surrounding valleys. The leaves on the aspens had turned golden, contrasting sharply with the evergreens and the cloudless blue sky. I kept a steady pace, stopping now and then to snap pictures or take a swig of water. By midday, I reached the base of the rock formation. It jutted out of the landscape like a jagged tooth, its reddish sandstone glowing in the afternoon sun. From this vantage point, I could see why climbers were drawn to it. It wasn't overly technical, but it demanded respect. The ascent required basic climbing skills, but nothing I couldn't handle. The real reward was the summit, which I imagined would feel like standing on the roof of the world. I took a break to eat a protein bar and gear up. After securing my helmet and double-checking my shoes, I started the climb. The first section was straightforward, almost fun. Handholds and footholds were abundant, and the rock was dry and grippy. I moved methodically, focusing on my movements and keeping my breathing steady. The higher I climbed, the better the views became. About halfway up, things got trickier. The rock face became steeper, and the holds less obvious. I reached a ledge where I could rest for a moment, taking in the sweeping vista below. The valley stretched out endlessly, dotted with patches of forest and meandering streams. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting long shadows. It was beautiful, breathtaking, even, but it also reminded me how isolated I was. There wasn't another soul out here. I shook off the thought and prepared for the next section. It was slightly more vertical, but I could see a clear path of holds leading upward. I took my time, testing each grip before committing my weight. I was nearly 3/4 of the way to the top when it happened. My right foot slipped. It was so sudden that I didn't have time to react. My hands scrambled for a hold, but the rock was slicker than I'd anticipated. Gravity took over and I fell. It wasn't a long drop, maybe 15 feet, but I landed awkwardly on a narrow ledge below. Pain shot through my right leg like a lightning bolt, and I cried out before clamping my mouth shut. For a moment, I lay there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. When the initial shock subsided, I propped myself up on my elbows and assessed the damage. My right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and my ankle was already swelling. I tried to move it, but the pain was excruciating. A sprain at best, a break at worst. Either way, walking was out of the question. The ledge I was on was about 3 feet wide and sloped slightly toward the cliff's edge. Above me, the route I had fallen from seemed impossibly far, and below, the drop was sheer. My backpack had come loose in the fall and was now hanging precariously on a lower ledge, just out of reach. My water, food, and first aid kit were inside. I cursed under my breath. I tried to think logically. The most important thing was to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse. I still had my phone in my jacket pocket, but when I pulled it out, my stomach sank. No service. Of course, I hadn't expected to have a signal out here, but the reality of it hit me hard. I was on my own. The sun was sinking fast now, bathing the landscape in deep orange light. I knew the temperature would plummet once darkness fell. I needed to act quickly, but my options were limited. Climbing down with an injured leg was a non-starter. Staying put meant enduring a freezing night without proper gear. I glanced at my backpack again, willing it to come closer, but it was no use. I shifted my weight carefully, trying to get comfortable, but the pain in my leg flared with every movement. I decided to splint it as best I could with what I had. Using my climbing helmet strap and a sturdy stick from my pocket knife kit, I immobilized the leg. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I wrapped my jacket tightly around myself. The wind picked up, biting through the fabric and chilling me to the bone. I huddled against the rock face, trying to conserve body heat. The stars began to emerge, one by one, until the sky was a glittering canopy. Under different circumstances, it would have been awe-inspiring. Now, it only reminded me how far I was from help. I kept my mind occupied by going over survival basics. I had read enough about hypothermia to know the signs to watch for. Shivering was normal. Drowsiness and confusion were not. I forced myself to stay awake, counting stars and replaying the climb in my head. Where had I gone wrong? Was it a bad hold? A lapse in focus? The questions gnawed at me, but they didn't change my situation. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared, I was exhausted and trembling uncontrollably. My leg throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, and my throat was parched. I hadn't had a drop of water in over 12 hours. When the sun finally rose, its warmth was a small comfort. I could see the terrain more clearly now, but it didn't offer any new solutions. I considered my options again. Waiting here wasn't sustainable. If I wanted to survive, I'd have to move, injured leg or not. I decided to attempt a controlled descent. Using my hands and good leg, I eased myself down the rock face inch by inch. It was agonizingly slow, and every movement sent jolts of pain through my injured limb. Twice, I nearly lost my grip, but sheer determination kept me going. It took hours, but I finally reached the base of the rock formation. My backpack was still out of reach, but I found a small stream nearby. I crawled to it and drank greedily, the cold water reviving me just enough to think clearly again. I used the emergency blanket I'd tucked into my jacket to fashion a crude shelter. The next step was getting help. I knew I wouldn't make it far on my own, so I decided to stay put and signal for rescue. Using rocks and branches, I spelled out "help" in large letters on an open patch of ground. By the second day, I was weak but alive. A park ranger spotted the signal from a helicopter, and a rescue team arrived soon after. They stabilized my leg and airlifted me to safety. Lying in the hospital bed later, I felt a mix of relief and gratitude. I had made mistakes, underestimated the route, overestimated my abilities, but I had survived. It was a harsh reminder of the risks that came with solo adventures, but it wouldn't stop me from returning to the mountains. Next time, though, I'd be more prepared. For our 5th anniversary, my boyfriend Matt and I decided to push ourselves with a multi-day hike in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia. We were both 31 and had always loved the outdoors. We'd done several long hikes before, but this time we wanted to challenge ourselves with something even more remote. We spent weeks poring over maps and reading forums to pick a route that was both rugged and scenic. The plan was a 5-day loop with no cell service and limited contact with the outside world. The trail passed through dense forests, alpine meadows, and a series of isolated lakes. We'd camp along the way, taking only what we could carry. Since cooking over a fire can be cumbersome in the backcountry, we decided to try a new brand of dehydrated meals we'd found online. The reviews were mixed, but they were lightweight and easy to pack. The first day went perfectly. The trailhead was quiet, with only a few other cars parked there. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the morning sun lit up the forest in a way that made everything feel alive. Matt and I were in good spirits, joking about how we'd dominate the wilderness as we navigated the twisting trail. We covered 12 kilometers by mid-afternoon, reaching a small lake surrounded by tall evergreens. We set up camp, filtered water, and rehydrated our dinner. The meals weren't great, but they were edible and we didn't think much of it. That night, under the stars, we talked about how lucky we were to have this time together. It felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The next morning, Matt mentioned feeling a bit off. He said his stomach was unsettled but shrugged it off as nothing. I didn't think much of it either. We packed up camp and continued on, the trail becoming steeper and more challenging. By the time we reached the second campsite, a clearing near a fast-moving stream, Matt looked pale and tired. He brushed it off, saying he was just dehydrated. We set up camp quickly so he could rest. That evening, he barely touched his food. I started to feel uneasy, but we were hours away from the nearest road, and Matt insisted he'd be fine after some sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of retching. Matt was outside the tent, doubled over, vomiting violently. His breathing was labored, and he kept clutching his stomach. I rushed to his side, but there was little I could do. When the vomiting stopped, he collapsed onto the ground, groaning in pain. His skin was clammy, and he said his stomach felt like it was being torn apart. I tried to give him water, but he couldn't keep anything down. I felt panic rising in my chest. We were at least 25 kilometers from the trailhead, and there was no one around to help. By dawn, Matt was worse. He couldn't stand without help, and his speech was slurred. I knew we couldn't stay there. The only question was whether to leave him behind or try to move together. Leaving him felt wrong, but taking him with me seemed impossible. He could barely sit up, let alone hike. The terrain ahead was steep and rocky, with no guarantee of finding help. I decided to leave him. It was the hardest choice I've ever made. I packed as lightly as I could, taking only water, a first aid kit, and a GPS beacon that could send a distress signal if I reached higher ground. I left Matt with extra water, a sleeping bag, and a tarp for shade. I told him I'd be back with help as soon as I could. He didn't respond. He was too weak to argue. As I started down the trail, I couldn't shake the guilt. Every step felt like a betrayal. The trail was brutal. The sun was relentless, and the air was thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I didn't stop. I kept replaying the image of Matt lying there, helpless. Hours passed, but I didn't see a single person. The isolation was crushing. I yelled for help every so often, my voice echoing off the mountains, but there was no answer. Around midday, I reached a ridge where the GPS finally picked up a signal. I activated the beacon and hoped it would work. Not long after, I spotted a small wooden cabin in a clearing below the ridge. It wasn't marked on any map I'd seen, but it looked old and sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone was there. I ran toward it, my legs trembling from exhaustion. Inside, I found a man in his 60s, wiry and weathered from years in the wilderness. He listened as I explained what had happened. Without hesitation, he grabbed a pack and motioned for me to lead the way. The hike back to Matt felt endless. I was terrified of what we might find. When we finally reached the campsite, my heart dropped. Matt was still there, but he looked worse. His breathing was shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish hue. The man quickly assessed the situation. He gave Matt a shot of something, an anti-nausea medication, he explained, and helped me get him into a makeshift stretcher he'd brought along. We hiked for hours, taking turns carrying the stretcher. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was dark. The man had a satellite phone in his truck and called for help. A rescue team arrived within an hour and rushed Matt to the hospital. Doctors said Matt had severe food poisoning, likely from one of the dehydrated meals. They told me that if I'd waited any longer, he might not have survived. Took him weeks to recover fully, but he did. As for me, I haven't forgiven myself for leaving him, even though I know it was the right thing to do. That decision will haunt me for the rest of my life. We've since returned to the mountains, but we're more cautious now. We double-check our supplies and never rely on untested food. The wilderness is still where we feel most alive, but it's also where we were reminded how fragile life can be.